There is a hill in Wiltshire tonight, and it is doing nothing at all. It stands 2 miles north of the city of Salisbury, in the soft green south of England, above the quiet valley of the river Avon, and on the last rising edge of Salisbury Plain, and at this hour, in the long blue slackening of a summer dusk, it is simply a ring of grass. A great ring. An enormous one. From the air it would look like something set down carefully on the downland by a very tidy giant. A series of perfect circles cut into the chalk, bank inside bank, ditch inside ditch. 56 acres of smooth green geometry with a raised mound at the very middle of it. The whole thing so round and so regular that the eye keeps insisting somebody must have meant it, which somebody did. A very long time ago indeed. The ditches are deep and beautifully curved, and at dusk they fill with a low silver mist that lies in them like milk in a bowl and does not move. The banks above the mist are cropped short by sheep and glow faintly, a pale luminous green, because the turf here is thin and the chalk underneath is white. And white chalk under thin turf holds the light long after the sky has begun to let it go. Rooks go over in ones and twos, unhurried, heading somewhere they know. The wind, which will matter enormously later, is doing what it always does here, which is blowing steadily and without any particular malice from the west, moving over the grass in long, slow strokes so that the whole hilltop seems to breathe. And the sheep are grazing, as they have grazed for 400 years, in a place where the grass grows in faint pale lines. If you stand up there and look down at your feet, you will notice the lines, and if you follow them with your eyes, you will find that they make a shape, and that the shape is a building, a very large building. There is a long rectangle of it, and then arms crossing, and then a rounded end, and low courses of flint and mortar just breaking the turf like the knuckles of a sleeping hand. The sheep are cropping the grass in the nave of a cathedral. They are standing where a choir once stood. They are lying down comfortably in the aisle. And 2 miles away, across a wide flat plain of soft fields and hedges and one small river doing its patient work, there is a spire. It is very tall and very pale and very slender, and at this hour it is catching the very last of the light along one side of itself, a thin line of amber standing straight up out of the far distance like a needle of warm glass. It is the tallest church spire in Britain. It has been the tallest church spire in Britain for 700 years. And it is standing exactly where it is standing, over there and not up here, because the hill you are looking at is empty. The hill is empty because the city that lived on it got up, one careful cart at a time, and walked down there. So settle now. Settle into whatever stillness you have managed to make for yourself tonight, whatever quiet corner of the world you have arranged around you, however imperfect it is. Let the lamp grow dim, or let it go out altogether. Let the screen fall dark, if it wants to, and let it stay dark. There is nothing here you need to look at. This is a story for the ears and for the back of the mind, and the back of the mind does its very best work with the eyes closed. Let your shoulders come down. Not all at once, because shoulders do not like being told. Just let them come down one quiet inch at a time, the way a heavy curtain comes down, slowly in folds. Let the jaw unclench. Let the hands stop holding whatever it is that the hands have been holding all day long, which is usually nothing, and which is usually held very tightly indeed. Let the small weight of the day slide off you and go and lie on the floor beside the bed, where you can pick it up again in the morning if you find that you still want it. You very probably will not. And let me say the kindest thing I know how to say, which is this: you do not need to remember any of this in the morning. Not one date, not one name, not one bishop, not one king, not one careful little fact. There is no examination at the end of this. If you are asleep within 4 minutes, then this has been a complete and unqualified success, and I will go on talking anyway, gently, in the background, for hours, the way rain goes on at a window whether or not anyone is listening to it. That is the whole arrangement. You drift, and I keep talking. Nothing is required of you tonight except the drifting. If you do enjoy the slow way I do these, then a like helps this find other people who are lying awake at this hour, and subscribing means the next one will come and find you on its own. But only, truly, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. There is no need to press anything out of politeness at 1 a.m, and if you feel like it, before you go under, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It is the loveliest thread on the channel. It is a long soft list of small hours from all over the world, 2:30 in Manchester, 10 in the evening in Ohio, 4 in the morning in Perth, and it does something quietly wonderful. Which is that it lets the next sleepless person scroll down and see in plain text that they are not the only one awake. That is worth more than it sounds. Leave your place and your hour and go to sleep. Now, because this channel does not do shocks and does not hold things back and does not save a surprise for the end to keep you awake with, let me tell you the entire shape of tonight before we begin, so that nothing whatsoever is waiting to pounce on you later. On that hill, on that empty ring of grass with the sheep in the nave, there once stood a complete city. Not a village, not an outpost, a city in the full medieval sense of the word, a royal castle on the mound at the centre, with a garrison in it and a king's officer commanding the gate, a great Norman cathedral standing beside it, with a bishop and his canons and his choir, a stone palace fit for the crown, houses, streets, wells that were not really wells, forges, stables, a mint that had struck the king's silver, walls, a gate, a bridge, and people. Hundreds of people. It was one of the most important places in England. Kings came here. The bishop who lived here ran the country. The whole landholding class of England once stood on this grass and swore an oath that helped make the English state a thing that could be said out loud. And then it stopped. Not violently. That is the point of the whole night, and I am giving it to you now, at the beginning, so you can relax into it. This city was never sacked. It was never burned. It was never taken by an enemy, never starved out in a siege, never emptied by plague, never drowned by the sea or swallowed by sand, or shaken down by an earthquake. Nothing dramatic happened to old Sarum. Ever. What happened to old Sarum is that it got tired. It got tired of the wind, which never stopped, and was so loud on that bare summit that the choir could not hear itself sing. It got tired of the thirst, because there is no water on a chalk hilltop, none, not a drop, and every barrel of it had to be dragged up the slope by cart, past a river that lay glittering at the bottom of the hill in full view, which is the sort of arrangement that would test a saint. It got tired of the glare, because white chalk in July throws the sun back into your face, and these were men who spent their lives reading small letters. And it got tired most of all of the gate, because the gate belonged to the soldiers and the cathedral belonged to the church, and there is no living arrangement on earth quite so wearing as sharing one door with somebody who is entitled to lock it. So the bishop wrote to Rome and asked, very politely, whether the cathedral might be permitted to move. And Rome said yes. And so, in the year 1220, in a wet meadow 2 miles south, where the rivers met, and the water was free, and the wind had somewhere else to be, 5 foundation stones were laid in the grass. And then the cathedral came down the hill. And then the canons came down the hill. And then the masons and the carters and the traders and the innkeepers and the servants and the families came down the hill over a generation, at walking pace, house by house, cart by cart, nobody hurried and nobody forced. And then the old cathedral itself was taken to pieces and carried down after them, and its stones were built into the wall around the new one, so that the old church still stands in a sense in fragments as a fence around its own child. And the new city they built down there in the meadow is called Salisbury. Its legal name, to this day, on paper, in the charters, is New Sarum. And that pale needle of a spire you can see from the empty ring, 404 feet of it, the tallest in Britain then, and the tallest in Britain now, was put up by the very city that had walked down off this hill, some 90 years after it arrived. which is the thing I would like you to keep somewhere soft in your mind as you go under tonight, the hill up there is not a grave. It is an empty house whose family moved somewhere better and left the door open behind them. So there is no villain tonight. There is no cruelty coming, no massacre, no betrayal, no cackling. Nobody in this story is wicked, not even slightly. The soldiers were doing their job, which was holding a royal castle, and holding a royal castle means holding the gate. And holding the gate means sometimes locking it. The bishop was doing his job, which was running a cathedral, and a cathedral needs water and quiet and room, of which the hill had none. The king was doing his job, which was mostly being somewhere else. Everybody behaved, on the whole, quite reasonably. What defeated old Sarum was wind, chalk, thirst, and a very long, very polite argument, and all of it was settled peacefully 800 years ago, and everyone involved has been comfortably asleep for a very long time. You may drift off at any point. You may drift off during the Romans, which many people do. You may drift off during a bishop, and wake for a moment during a storm, and go under again during a mint. It makes no difference to the story, and no difference to me. The hill will still be there in the morning, doing nothing, extremely well. Now let us go back. Not to the city, not yet. Let us go back to before there was anything here worth naming, because you cannot really understand why anyone bothered with this hill until you have stood on it when it was only a hill. Begin with the chalk. All of this country, all of the great pale rolling body of Salisbury Plain, and the downs that run away from it in every direction, is chalk, and chalk is a very strange and very gentle thing to build a story on. It is not really rock in the way that granite is rock. It is the packed and pressed remains of an unimaginable number of very small sea creatures, laid down grain by grain on the floor of a warm, shallow ocean over tens of millions of years, in a silence that nothing ever disturbed, and then lifted up, slowly and without fuss, into the daylight of southern England. Every hill in this story is made of the patient dust of animals too small to see. When the wind blows the chalk dust off a bare path here on a dry day, and it goes up in a fine white haze and gets into your boots and your hair and the creases of your hands, that is the sea, still going about its business, several million years late. Chalk does two things that matter tonight. The first is that it drinks. Rain does not run off chalk, rain goes into it, straight down, through it and into it, and disappears, and comes out again far below in springs at the bottom of the valleys. That is why the streams here are so extraordinarily clear, and so extraordinarily cold, and so steady all year round, and it is also why the tops of these hills are as dry as an attic. The water is all there, it is simply not up where you are. It is under your feet by 150 feet of white stone, on its way somewhere else, and it will not be argued with. Remember that gently, and let it go. It is going to win an argument with a cathedral in about 2,000 years. The second thing chalk does is that it cuts. It is soft. It is astonishingly soft. A man with an antler pick and a shoulder blade for a shovel and enough afternoons can move a truly ridiculous quantity of it, and it stands up afterwards. You can carve a ditch into chalk 20 feet deep and pile the spoil into a bank 40 feet high, and it will still be there, still recognisably ditch and bank, 2,000 years later, softened at the edges like a bar of soap in a bathroom, but there. Chalk keeps its shape. Chalk remembers. Everything you can see on that hill tonight, every curve and every rampart, is chalk remembering. So, the chalk, and on top of the chalk, a thin skin of turf, close cropped and springy and full of tiny flowers. The kind of turf you can walk on all day without ever getting tired, and under the turf, flints, black and glassy and irregular, lying in the white like currants in a cake.
And over all of it, the wind. There is nothing to stop the wind here.
Salisbury Plain is an enormous open shoulder of high ground, with no forest to speak of on its crown, and no mountains to break the weather. and the air comes in off the Atlantic and crosses the whole of the West Country and arrives here still travelling. On a still day, the wind on the plain is a whisper in the grass. On an ordinary day, it is a hand on your back. On a bad day, it will take the words out of your mouth and post them into the next county before you have finished saying them. And below, in the valley, the River Avon, going quietly by. Not a great river, a perfectly ordinary chalk stream, clear enough to count the pebbles in, weeded with long green ribbons that lie all one way in the current, full of trout, cold in every season, and utterly reliable. It comes down off the plain, and it goes on south to the sea, and it has never once in all this story done anything at all except be exactly where it was needed and slightly too far down the hill. That is the whole stage. Chalk, turf, flint, wind, and a river out of reach. Nothing here at all. And nobody, for a very long time, except the small and patient people who left their long barrows on the ridges like loaves of bread left out to cool, and who about 10 miles off across the plain put up a ring of standing stones that we now call Stonehenge, and that they called something we shall never know. We mention it once and let it be. It was already ancient and already mysterious to every single person in this story. When the Romans looked at Stonehenge, they had no more idea what it was than we do. There is a particular comfort in that at this hour, the people you are about to meet, the ones who seem so unreachably long ago, were themselves standing about scratching their heads at something unreachably long ago. Everybody is somebody's ancient history. Let that one drift past. Now, about 4 centuries before Christ, which is to say more than 2,300 years ago, people came to this particular spur of chalk at the end of the plain, where the ground falls away on almost every side and the valley of the Avon opens beneath, and they looked at it for a while and they decided to make it into a fortress. We do not know their names. We do not know what they called themselves, or the hill, or the river, or each other. We know a certain amount about how they lived, which was in round houses with conical thatched roofs and a fire in the middle and no chimney, so that the smoke found its own way out through the thatch, and everything they owned smelled faintly and permanently of wood smoke. We know they kept cattle and sheep and pigs, grew barley and wheat and beans, wove wool and worked iron, and buried their dead with a care that suggests they had opinions about what came next. And we know that at some point in those centuries, a great many of them stood on this hill with antler picks and baskets, and began to dig. What they made is still, tonight, the largest single fact on that hill, and it is worth taking slowly. They cut an enormous circular ditch, and threw the chalk up on the inside to make a bank, and then in places they did it again, so that anyone approaching had to go down into a ditch, and up a bank, and down into another ditch, and up another bank, all of it dazzling white when it was new. Because freshly cut chalk is not the soft green thing you see now, it is blinding. Picture that for a moment as you lie there, a hill in the middle of a wide green country, and on top of it a set of vast perfect rings of raw white chalk, visible for miles in every direction, glowing in the sun like something dropped from the sky. It must have been the most extraordinary thing anyone in that valley had ever seen. It certainly was not subtle. That was rather the idea. The scale is hard to hold in the mind, so let me give it to you slowly, as a small task for the drifting brain to lose interest in. 56 acres. Perhaps 30 football pitches. A ditch that in places was cut down some 40 feet from the crest of the bank above it, dug with picks made of red deer antler, and shovels made of the shoulder blades of cattle, and baskets and hands and time. No metal tools worth speaking of, no wheelbarrows, no carts on that slope, just a very large number of people carrying a very large number of baskets of white rubble up a slope, day after day, season after season, probably for years, almost certainly while complaining. It is one of the oldest and truest facts about human beings that we will move a mountain by hand if the alternative is feeling unsafe. And why here? Why go up when everything a body actually needs, water, shelter, wood, warmth, level ground, is down there in the valley, in easy reach, beside the clear cold river? This is the question the whole night turns on. So let us answer it kindly and completely now, while we are still calm about it. Because for a very long time, and for very good reasons, height was worth more than water. A high place is dry, and a dry place does not rot. Grain keeps in it, and in a world with no other insurance, grain that keeps is life. A high place is healthy, or seemed so. The mists and the fevers and the sour damp of the valley bottoms stayed below. A high place can be seen from, and seeing is everything. From that ring you can watch the whole country for miles, and see who is coming a full day before they arrive. A high place can be defended, because an enemy must come uphill at you, out of breath, into your ditch which is deep, and up your bank, which is white and slippery and steeper than it looks. And a high place can be seen by others, which is possibly the most important thing of all. A great white ring on a hill is not only a fort, it is a statement. It says, without needing to shout, that the people who live here were able to do this, and are therefore able to do other things, and you might like to think carefully before finding out what. So they carried the water. Of course they carried the water. They carried it up in skins and pots and buckets from the springs and the river below every single day for centuries, and they did not think of it as a hardship, because it was simply the rent you paid for living somewhere safe. Water is heavy and hills are tiring, and neither of those facts is as heavy or as tiring as being afraid. That bargain, carry the water, keep the height, was made on this hill more than 2,000 years ago, and it held. It held through everything. It held so well and for so long that nobody thought to question it for something like 16 centuries. And then one day some canons with sore eyes and a hoarse choir sat down and did the arithmetic again, and found to everyone's mild surprise that the answer had quietly changed. But that is a long way off yet. For now the ring is white and new, and there are round houses inside it with smoke coming up through the thatch. And there are cattle in the ditch bottom, and dogs asleep in the sun, and children running along the top of the bank the way children have run along the top of every bank ever made, and the wind is doing what it does, and the view is magnificent, and nobody is going anywhere. Then the Romans came, in the year 43 after Christ, or thereabouts, in this part of the country, and the hill forts of southern England went quiet, not all at once, and mostly not violently in this particular corner. The Roman method was rarely to knock a place down if the place could be persuaded to be useful. And the thing about this hill was that it stood at a crossing. Roads are the real Roman miracle, more than the villas and more than the baths, and here in Wiltshire several of them met. A road came up from the south coast and the harbours. A road came in from the west, from the Lead and the silver of the Mendips. A road went north toward the great crossroads of the country, and another went east toward Winchester, which was Venta Belgarum then, and mattered enormously. Where roads meet, a place happens, whether or not anyone plans it, because travellers must stop, and stopping travellers must eat, and people who feed stopping travellers must live somewhere, and there you are, a town, growing out of the simple fact that this is where you change horses. They called it Sorvia Dunum. The second half of that name, that Dunum, is an old British word for a fort on a hill, which tells you something rather lovely. The Romans, naming the place in their own tongue, kept the local word for the ring that was already there, already ancient, already sitting on the skyline when they arrived. Even the conquerors called it after the earthwork. The hill named itself, and the hill kept its name. Sorvia Dunum was not a grand place. There was no forum here, no temple worth remembering, no theatre. It was a junction settlement, a working sort of a place, spread out mostly on the lower ground around the foot of the hill rather than up in the old ring itself. Posting stations. Stables, storehouses, a bathhouse probably, because there was always a bathhouse, wagons, mud, iron tyres on stone. Somebody, at some point, dropped a coin, which we found. Somebody else lost a brooch, which we also found, and which is now in a case gently labelled in a museum down the hill in the city that did not exist yet. For nearly 400 years the roads carried and the junction worked, and the hill above sat there with its old white rings going slowly green. And the whole arrangement was so ordinary that almost nothing was written down about it, which is the very best thing that can be said about any place. And then the Roman world in Britain came apart, slowly, the way a rope comes apart, strand by strand, over a generation or two, and the legions went, and the money went, and the roads stopped being repaired, and the grass came up through the paving, and the junctions stopped junctioning, and the little town at the foot of the hill emptied out and blew away, and for a long stretch of years that we can barely see into at all, the hill was quiet again, and had the wind and the sheep and the enormous view all to itself. The Saxons found it, of course. Everybody found it. That is the recurring joke of this hill. No one who ever came into this valley failed to look up at that ring and think, well, that is obviously the answer. The English called it Sereburg, or Serebur, and that ending, the bur, is the important part, because a bur in Anglo-Saxon England was a very particular thing. It was not just a town, it was a fortified place, a defended place, part of a system, a place people could get inside of when things went badly. And in the 9th and 10th centuries in Wessex, things went badly with a dreary regularity, because of the Danes. So the old white rings were refortified, the ditches were cleaned out, the banks were built up and topped with timber and palisade, and the hill went back to work after some hundreds of years off, doing exactly what it had been built to do at the very beginning, by people whose language nobody alive could speak, and whose names nobody alive had ever known. There is something rather satisfying about that, in a slow way. The Iron Age diggers made a machine for keeping people safe, and it sat idle for 4 centuries. And then somebody wound it up again and it worked perfectly. Nothing built today will be picked up and reused, unaltered and unimproved, after 400 years in the grass. And a bur, being safe, becomes valuable, and being valuable becomes rich, and so Sereburg acquired the surest possible sign that a place matters, a royal mint. They struck silver pennies up here on the hilltop, with the king's head on one side and the moneyer's name and the name of the place on the other, shortened, as coins always shorten things, to those first few letters, Zero. Think of that for a moment while the wind moves in the grass. Up on this cold, windy ring, in a shed somewhere behind a palisade, a man with a hammer and 2 iron dies and a small blank disc of silver, striking the king's money one blow at a time, thousands and thousands of times, and every single coin going out into the country and into purses and pockets and hoards and buried pots, carrying the name of this hill. They are still turning up. Farmers find them. Detectorists find them, little silver crumbs of a hilltop, scattered across 1,000 years, all quietly saying the name of a place that is now a field. These are the years of Alfred and his children and grandchildren, of the long grinding negotiation with the Danes, and then, in the 11th century, the tide comes in again. In the year 1003, Swen Forkbeard came up the valley and sacked the town of Wilton, which lay only a few miles west, and which was then the old county town, a proper Saxon place with a great nunnery and a long history, and a good deal more importance than the hill had. Wilton burned. Sereburg, up on its rings, did not. That single fact did more for this hilltop than a century of anything else, because after that, the argument for the high dry safe ring rather made itself, and the balance of importance in this valley began to shift, slowly, from the comfortable town beside the water to the windy fortress above it. Wilton never quite got it back. It is a very pretty place today, with a fine house and a famous carpet works, and it is a village compared to what it was, and the reason is a hill it can nearly see from the end of its own street. And then Nut and the Danes ruling England outright, and the whole strange calm of that reign, and the hill under it all doing what it always did, standing high, dry, windy, useful, obvious. Coins struck, ditches kept, grass cropped, wind blowing. 1,000 years of people agreeing, without ever needing to discuss it, that if you are going to put something in this valley that must not be lost, you put it up on that ring. And so we arrive at the middle of the 11th century, and I want to leave you here for tonight, in the last few years before everything changes, because it is a very peaceful place to stop. Stand on the bank in the year 1065 and look about. Below you, the Avon in its meadows, cold and clear and going south. Around you, the enormous rings, green now, softened, ancient even then, wearing their 1,000-odd years lightly. Inside them, a small, tough, thriving Saxon burh, timber halls, thatch, palisade, smoke, the mint, the church, a track winding up through the gate, carts, sheep, the eternal patient traffic of barrels of water coming uphill. Around it, the plain, pale and open. Over it, rooks, through it, wind, and nothing at all to suggest that this arrangement would ever end. Why would it? It had worked for 1,000 years, and it had every reason to work for 1,000 more. That is the thing about places that are about to change completely. From the inside, on the evening before, they look permanent. They look the way your own life looks to you tonight, which is to say settled, obvious and unremarkable, and simply the way things are. The people up here in the year 1065 would have laughed at the suggestion that within 200 years there would not be a soul on this hill, that the mint would be gone, and the church, and the houses, and even the stones of the houses, and that everyone they loved and everything they owned would be down there in a wet meadow they currently used for grazing. But something was coming, and it was coming, as these things do, by sea. Away to the south, past Wilton and past the harbours, and out over the grey water, there was a duke in Normandy with a claim and a fleet and an enormous appetite for building castles on other people's hills. And in a year or so he would land, and he would win, and he would look around his new kingdom for high, dry, defensible ground with a view, the sort of thing he liked best in all the world, and he would find, waiting for him in Wiltshire, ready-made and free of charge and 2,000 years old, the most perfect earthwork in southern England, a great ring already dug, already banked, already proven, sitting there like a gift. And he would put a castle on the mound in the middle of it, and a cathedral beside it, and a bishop in the cathedral, and a garrison in the castle, and all of England's landowners on the grass in between, and for 150 years this quiet hill would be one of the loudest and grandest and most important places in the kingdom. And then, gently, it would begin to be impossible, but not tonight. Tonight the wind is only wind, and the rings are only grass, and the mint is still striking silver, and the water is still coming up the hill in barrels, and nobody has arrived yet, and nothing is wrong. Let the year stay at 1065 a little while. Let the smoke go up through the thatch. Let the rooks come home. Let the mist settle in the ditches like milk in a bowl, exactly as it is doing tonight, 2,000 years of evenings all lying down in the same white grooves, and let the hill be what it has always been best at being, which is simply, patiently, quietly there. Breathe out. Nothing needs deciding. Sleep as much of this as you like. And so we come at last to the year that changed the ownership of everything, and we come to it gently, because the conquest, for all its noise elsewhere, arrived at this particular hill in the mildest way imaginable. In the autumn of 1066, a duke from Normandy crossed the narrow sea, and a king of England rode south from one battle to fight another, and by the end of one long day near Hastings, the crown of England had changed hands. You know that much already, and there is no need for us to go and watch it tonight. What matters for our hill is what happened afterwards, in the slow grey months and years that followed, when the new king had to work out what to do with a country he had taken, but did not yet hold. He was a practical man, William the Conqueror, practical in the way that stonemasons and tax collectors are practical, and the first thing a practical conqueror does is look at a map, and the second thing he does is look for high ground, and the third thing he does is look for high ground that somebody else has already fortified for him, which is how a Norman king came to stand one day on a windy chalk ring in Wiltshire, 2 miles north of a green river valley, and find that the work had all been done, and done superbly, some 1400 years before he was born. Consider his good fortune, and consider it kindly, because it is genuinely lovely. Everywhere else in England the Normans had to dig. They arrived with plans and with impatience, and they set thousands of Englishmen to shovelling, and they raised their castles out of the raw wet earth of the places they wanted to hold, and the mounds took months, and the ditches took months. And the whole business was cold and slow and unloved. But here, on this one down above the Avon, the earth was already shaped. The Iron Age people had raised the great outer ring in the age before Rome. The Romans had run their straight roads to the foot of it. The Saxons had refortified it as a burh against the Danes and put a royal mint inside it and struck their small silver coins up there in the wind. 14 centuries of other people's labour lay ready and waiting, banked and ditched and settled and turfed, and all of it perfectly usable, and none of it needing a single Norman spade to make it work. William looked at that, and William, being William, took it. About the year 1070 then, a royal castle went up on the inner mound at the middle of the ring. It was not at first the great stone thing you might be picturing. It began as the Normans always began, with timber and haste, a wooden tower on a raised knot of chalk with a palisade around it, standing inside the far older ring like a small hard seed inside a very large fruit. But the shape of the thing was there from the start, and the shape is what lasted. The inner mound was given its own ditch, deep and white-sided and cut down into the clean chalk, so that the castle sat inside a ring, a fortress within a fortress. And the whole arrangement was so obviously and immediately strong that nobody afterwards ever seriously tried to take it. In time the timber gave way to stone, as it always did, and a great courtyard castle grew on that mound, with curtain walls and a gatehouse and towers, and a well sunk down and down through the chalk. And it became one of the royal keys of the south of England, one of the places from which a king held a country. But in its first summer it was only a wooden tower on a green mound, drying in the wind, smelling of fresh-cut timber and cut chalk, with rooks going over it in the evening, and the whole enormous ancient ring lying quiet all around it in the dusk. And in that same year, or very near it, this hill was given the honour of holding the last act of the conquest, and it is one of the strangest and most peaceable scenes in all of English history, and almost nobody knows that it happened here. William had won England with an army he had rented. That is the plain truth of it, and it is said tonight without any unkindness. A good part of the force that came across in 1066 was mercenary, hired men out of Flanders and Brittany and Maine and half the rest of the continent, adventurers and second sons and professionals who had come for pay and for plunder and for whatever land might be left lying about at the end of it, and who had now, after 4 years of hard riding and hard weather and harder work, done exactly what they were hired to do. An army like that is a wonderful thing to have while you are taking a kingdom, and an absolutely terrible thing to have once you have taken it. It eats, it drinks, it wants paying, it has opinions. And it is composed, in the main, of men who are very good indeed at violence, and who are now suddenly unemployed in a country full of nervous strangers. So the king brought them here. He summoned his mercenaries up onto the chalk, into the great ring, out of the towns and well away from anything they could easily set fire to. And on this hill he paid them off and disbanded them and sent them home. That is how the Norman conquest of England actually ended. Not with a siege, not with a slaughter, but with a paymaster's table on a windy hilltop in Wiltshire, and a long patient queue of tired foreign soldiers being counted out their silver and told, with great politeness and considerable firmness, that their services were no longer required, and that the ships were that way. It is a very old Sarum sort of an event. Almost everything of consequence that ever happened on this hill happened calmly, and was settled by arrangement rather than by force, and involved somebody going somewhere else at the end of it. Even the conquest, when it finally finished here by walking away downhill. Then came the church, and with the church came the thing that made this place extraordinary, and also, in the fullness of time, impossible. In 1075 a council met in London and decided, as councils do, to tidy something up. The Normans had a policy about bishops, and the policy was sensible and rather modern, and it went like this. A bishop should not sit in a village. The Old English Church had grown up organically, the way a hedge grows, and its bishops sat where history had happened to leave them, out in small quiet places in the fields, at Sherborne in Dorset and at Ramsbury in Wiltshire. Minster settlements that had made perfect sense when they were founded, and made rather less of it now. The Normans wanted their bishops in walled towns, in places of weight, in places with a castle and a garrison and a road, where the church would stand beside the power of the crown and be plainly seen to do so. So the Council of London ordered the two old sees of Sherborne and Ramsbury to be joined together and moved, and the place they were moved to was this hill. And in that one administrative sentence, passed by tired men in a room in London on a winter afternoon, the whole future of our story was quietly written. Because that decision put a cathedral inside a castle. It did not look like a problem. It looked like efficiency. Here was a great ring of ancient earth with a royal fortress in the middle of it. And space, apparently, all around the edges. Here was safety, and height, and visibility, and a king's protection, and every single thing a Norman bishop was supposed to want. Nobody in that room noticed that the hill had no water, because nobody in that room had ever carried a barrel up it. Nobody noticed that the ring, vast as it looked from the fields below, was really quite small once you had put a castle in the middle of it, and a garrison all around the castle. Nobody noticed that a hill chosen for its wind and its dryness and its long clear sight lines might turn out to be an awkward sort of place in which to sing. They only noticed that it was strong. And it was. It was extremely strong. That was rather the trouble, in the end, and it took 150 years for anybody to say so out loud. But before the trouble there was the glory, and the glory was real, and we should sit down inside it for a while. 11 years after the conquest, this hill was a cathedral city. Think for a moment about how quickly that happened. Within a single lifetime, within the span of one ordinary man's memory, a windswept ancient earthwork that had been slowly declining into a provincial Saxon strongpoint became a royal castle, a bishop's seat, a building site, a market, a garrison, a mint and a town. Carts came up the chalk track all day long. Masons arrived with their tools and their marks and their private mysteries. Timber came in from the woods, and stone came in from the quarries at Chilmark, and flint came straight out of the ground under their feet, and the whole hill filled up with the noise of construction. That particular noise of iron on stone and men shouting measurements into the wind, which is the sound a century makes when it is being ambitious. And then, in the summer of 1086, this hill briefly became the most important patch of grass in England. On the 1st of August in that year, William summoned to Old Sarum the great landholders of England. Not merely his own barons, which was ordinary, which was any Tuesday. He summoned the men who mattered, and beneath them the men who mattered locally, the tenants who held their land not from the king at all, but from the barons, and he brought them all up here to this ring on the chalk, and there, standing on the grass, they swore allegiance to him directly, personally, over the heads of their own lords, which is a small technical detail with an enormous shadow standing behind it. Because the whole logic of the world they had come from was that a man owed his loyalty to his lord, and his lord owed his loyalty upward, and if your lord rebelled, then you rebelled with him. And that is precisely how the continent had spent the previous 3 centuries setting itself on fire. What was sworn up here quietly cut that chain. Every substantial landholder in England became, in that hour, the king's man first, whoever else he might also happen to be. That is what the Oath of Salisbury did, in the wind, in the high summer of 1086, and it is one of the reasons that England spent the following centuries being a single country rather than a polite collection of arguments. And they did it in the same year, and this is the part that gives the whole scene its weight, that the Domesday Book was finished. All that winter and spring the King's Commissioners had been riding out across England, into every shire and every hundred and every village, asking their relentless flat questions. Who holds this land? Who held it before? How many ploughs? How many mills? How many acres of meadow? How much is it worth? How much was it worth then? The answers came back, and were sifted and copied and compressed into a single enormous survey of an entire kingdom, a book so final and so unanswerable that people began calling it after the Day of Judgment, because there was no appealing from it. And in the very summer that the book came in from the country, the men whose lands were written in it came up this hill and swore. The survey and the promise, the ledger and the oath, arriving together on the chalk in the same warm month. If you want a birthplace for the English state, you could do a great deal worse than a treeless hilltop in Wiltshire, with the wind blowing sideways and several hundred men on horseback standing about in the sun, waiting their turn to say 11 words. And now the cathedral, which is the heart of this hill, and the reason we are here at all, and also, rather endearingly, the source of the single finest joke in the entire 800 years of this story. It began under Bishop Herman, who was the first bishop of the moved see, an old man by then. A Fleming who had been a bishop in England since before the conquest, and who had already spent decades trying to get his cathedral moved somewhere more sensible. Which tells you something rather charming about the recurring theme of this place. He laid it out, and he began it, and he got the footings down into the chalk, and then he died in 1078, with his church a few courses high and full of scaffolding, which is the fate of a great many of the people who begin cathedrals, and after him came the man who finished it, and the man who is, in the end, the presiding spirit of the whole hill. Osmond St. Osmond in time, though not for another 379 years, which we shall come to on a later night. He was a Norman, a kinsman of the Conqueror, a nobleman by birth, and he had been the royal chancellor, which means that he had been the king's writing office and the king's memory and the king's filing system all at once, the man who kept the seal and the records and knew where everything was, and he was almost certainly one of the men who made the great survey work at all. And then he became a bishop, and he stopped being an administrator and became something rather better. He finished the cathedral. He built up his community of canons and gave them a rule and a school and a library, copying books out with his own hands, which for a great magnate of the conquest generation is a lovely and slightly startling thing to picture. The king's chancellor sitting up in the wind with a pen, doing the ordinary careful work himself. He got the church roofed and glazed and finished, and in 1092 he consecrated it. There was a great day. There was, we may safely assume, a procession, and incense and chant, and every notable in Wessex packed into the new nave, and holy water flicked along the fresh-cut stone and bells, and the enormous quiet satisfaction of a building at last complete after 16 years of scaffolding and dust. And 5 days later a storm came over Salisbury Plain and tore the roof off and wrecked the tower. 5 days. The paint was not dry. The scaffolding had barely been carted away down the hill. There is no reading of this that is not, at some level, funny, and the chroniclers who wrote it down clearly thought so too, though they were obliged to be solemn about it, and to speak of the judgment of heaven and the fragility of the works of men. But we are lying down in the dark 800 years later, and we are allowed to say the thing they could not, which is that the highest and windiest hill for many miles around, freshly crowned with a brand new tower, was struck by lightning in a thunderstorm, and that this is not a portent, it is meteorology. Build the tallest thing on the tallest hill on the biggest open plain in southern England, and the sky will eventually offer its opinion. It offered it rather promptly. It is worth noticing, though, and noticing gently what happened next, because it is the whole character of this place in one small gesture. Nobody said that the hill was cursed. Nobody said that they should never have built here. Nobody in 1092 said one single word about moving. They simply went and got more timber and rebuilt the roof and repaired the tower and got on with it and did not complain, and the cathedral stood for another 130 years. The argument about this hill was never going to be settled by lightning. It was going to be settled, very slowly indeed, by wind and thirst and a locked gate and a very great deal of patient paperwork, and it would take a century and a quarter more to finish. Osmond gave this hill something else as well, And it is the thing that travelled furthest of all, and it is invisible, and you can still hear it tonight if you know what you are listening for. He gave England the Sarum use. Now the Sarum use is one of those phrases that sounds like a footnote, and is in fact a foundation, so let us be slow and kind about what it means. Every cathedral in that age had its own way of doing things, its own order of service, its own calendar of saints, its own arrangement of processions, its own chants, its own customs about where the choir stood and who carried what, and which words came in which order on which day of which season. They were not wildly different from one another, but they were different, and they had grown up locally, the way that accents grow up locally, so that the church in one place did not quite sing the same year as the church in the next. And out of this hill, out of Osmond's small windy community of canons in their new and recently unroofed cathedral, there came an ordering, a customary, a full and careful and rather beautiful account of exactly how it should all be done. The rite of Sarum. And it spread. It spread the way that good, clear well made things spread quietly on their merits, because they worked. It went to the neighbouring dioceses and then to the far ones, and within a couple of centuries the use of Sarum was the way that nearly all of England worshipped, and much of Wales, and much of Ireland, and it reached up into Scotland and across to houses on the continent, and for something like 400 years, from the 12th century down to the Reformation. If you had walked into an English parish church at Christmas or at Candlemas or on Palm Sunday and watched what the priest did and heard what the choir sang, you were watching and hearing this hill. Every English Christmas has this chalk ring somewhere in its ancestry. And the joke, if it is a joke, and it is a very gentle one, is that all of this came out of a place where the canons could barely hear themselves sing. The wind-up here took the sound straight out of their mouths and threw it across the down and away over the plain. The most influential music in England was composed and ordered and perfected by a choir standing in a gale, singing into weather that carried every note off toward Hampshire before it could reach the back of the nave. A small, cold, waterless hill taught a whole nation how to sing, and could not hear the song. And then came Roger, and under Roger this place reached its absolute height, and there has never been anything on this hill before or since so grand as what Roger built, and there never will be again. Roger of Salisbury became bishop about 1102, and held the see until 1139, and to call him a bishop is to describe roughly a third of him. He was, for most of the reign of Henry I, the effective ruler of England whenever the king was not actually in it, which was very often, because the king had Normandy to attend to as well. Roger was chancellor and then justiciar, which is a word we no longer use, and which meant, in practice, chief minister and regent and chief justice and head of the treasury all bundled together in one man. He is credited with organising the exchequer itself, that beautiful and pedantic apparatus of the checkered cloth and the counters and the twice-yearly audit, which is the direct ancestor of the way that governments still count their money. He ran the country. He ran it for something like 30 years, and he ran it when he was at home from up here. So the hill grew rich, and the hill grew magnificent. Roger was a builder in the way that some men are drinkers, helplessly, gloriously, and at enormous expense. He built at Devizes and at Sherborne and at Malmesbury, and the chroniclers who thoroughly disliked his politics could not help admiring his masonry. They wrote that his work was so exact that the joints of the stones deceived the eye, and the whole wall seemed to be cut from one single block. And what he did up here was to take Osmond's compact Norman church and make it a cathedral to be reckoned with. He pushed out the east end. He lengthened it and widened it and roughly doubled it. He gave it islered transepts and towers and a great new choir, and he filled it with light and carving and colour, because these buildings were never the bare grey things we imagine them to be. They were painted, they were red and blue and gold, the piers were patterned, the walls were pictures, and in the candle smoke on a winter afternoon with the wind outside it must have been rather like standing inside a jewel. And beside it, inside the castle, on the inner mound, he raised a palace, Not a hall, a palace, a great courtyard house of dressed stone, with a hall and a chapel and a tower and ranges of chambers around an inner court, the finest domestic building for 100 miles in any direction, a place fit to lodge a king, because it regularly did. So picture the hill now, at its zenith, in about the year 1120, and let us walk it slowly, because this is the moment that the whole night has been climbing toward, and you may drift off inside it if you like, and I rather hope you do. From the fields below you would see it long before you reached it, the enormous green ring up on the skyline, the banks showing white where the chalk broke through the turf, and rising out of the middle of it the castle wall, and out of the middle of that the palace, and beside it, filling the whole northern quarter of the ring, the cathedral, tower and roof and lead catching the light. It looked, from a distance, like a crown set down on the down. Coming up the track you would pass the carts, always the carts, going up empty and coming down empty, and the water barrels, always the barrels, because every wet thing on this hill had arrived here on a wheel, in through the east gate, and the gate is stone now and the gate has soldiers on it, and inside there is a town. Not a large one, it could not be large, but a real one crammed in tight against the inside of the ancient bank, the cannons' houses, the smiths, the masons' lodges with their chippings underfoot, an ale-house or two, the bishop's men and the king's men and the market and the mint. The whole place is loud, everything is loud on that hill, because there are stone walls and no trees, so every hammer and hoof and bell rings off the masonry and gets blown across the grass. Rooks in the roof timbers arguing, chalk dust on every boot and hem, white on black, so that every man on this hill looks faintly dusted over, like a baker at the end of a shift. The smell of cold stone and candle smoke and horses and rain coming in from the west. And over all of it, all day and all night, in every season and every year, the wind, which the people up here no longer heard at all, because you cannot hear a thing that never stops. It was the most modern place in the county. It was a castle, a cathedral, a palace, a mint, a court, a treasury, a school and a library, all packed into a ring of earth that some forgotten people had thrown up before Caesar was born. It was full, it was proud, and it was, though nobody had yet said it aloud, already quietly impossible. Two great institutions, the king's and the church's, wedged into one enclosure about the size of a large farm, sharing one gate, one road, one hilltop, and no water whatsoever. As long as one man held the balance, it worked perfectly well. Roger held the balance, because Roger was both, or very nearly both. He was the bishop, and he was also the government, and while he stood there it did not much matter whose gate it was, because it was his gate either way. And then Roger fell, and he fell in the course of a single summer, and the balance never came back. Henry I died in 1135, and the crown went to his nephew Stephen, and Stephen was by every account a thoroughly likeable man, which turns out to be an insufficient qualification. The country slid into the long civil war that they later called the Anarchy, and in a civil war the first thing that happens is that everybody begins counting everybody else's castles. And Roger had rather a lot of castles. He also had rather a lot of money, and nephews in the great offices of state, and a lifetime of being indispensable, which is a splendid thing to be right up until the day that it stops. In the summer of 1139, at a council at Oxford, there was a scuffle over lodgings between his men and another lord's men, and it was small and stupid, and it was quite enough. And the king arrested him. An old man, the chief minister of England for 30 years, taken at court over an argument about rooms. He was made to surrender his castles one by one, and he surrendered them, and Devizes, the greatest of them, the pride of his whole life, went too. Everything he had built was taken back from him in a matter of weeks, and he was let go, ruined, and he died before the year was out, in 1139, and they buried him in the cathedral that he had doubled. There is no cruelty in the story, and there is no villain in it either. It is only what happens to indispensable men. Eventually, everywhere, in every age, it has been happening for a very long time, and it is happening somewhere tonight. And so the hill was left as it would remain for the next 80 years. The castle stayed the king's, held by a royal castellan with a garrison and a gate. The cathedral stayed the bishop's, held by a bishop who was now only a bishop. 2 powers, 1 ring, 1 gate, no water, and no Roger to keep the peace between them. Nothing broke. Nothing burned. The bells still rang, and the chant still went up and was still blown away over the plain, and the carts still came up with the water, and the masons still worked. And the city on the hill was at that hour the finest thing in Wiltshire, magnificent and crowded and busy and complete. It simply had, from that year onward, 2 masters and 1 door. And that, in the mildest possible way, was the beginning of the end, though the ending would take another 100 years, and would not be settled by a sword. It would be settled by a letter to Rome. But that is for later, and there is no hurry at all, and none of it is happening now. For now let it be about 11:40, and let the hill be full. The lamps are lit in the cannons' houses. The garrison has shut the gate for the night, as it does, without asking anyone. The palace windows are warm. Somewhere under the roof of the great church a choir is singing an order of service that will still be sung in 1,000 parishes 400 years from now, and the wind is taking their voices out over the ditches and away across the dark down, and nobody minds at all, because nobody up here has ever known it to be any other way. And so the hill went on, as hills do, after the great man who had rebuilt it was gone. Bishop Roger of Salisbury died in 1139, and the stone he had raised did not notice. The palace he had built inside the castle walls kept its handsome courtyard and its fine ashlar and its long cool rooms, and simply waited, as buildings wait, for somebody else to walk into them. The cathedral he had doubled kept its new bays and its widened arms, and the singing went on in it that evening exactly as it had gone on the evening before, because the singing was older than any bishop, and had learned over 60 years on that windy summit to keep going whatever the weather did. Nothing on the hill fell down when Roger fell. That is the strange thing about the end of a great career. The world does not lurch. The rooks come back to the same ledge at the same hour. The barrels of water come up the same track at the same slow pace. The wind does what it has done since before there were words for it. And only afterwards, 30 or 40 or 80 years afterwards, when everybody who was there is long asleep under the chalk, does anyone look back and notice the exact evening on which a place quietly stopped being able to hold itself together? Because this is the chapter of the slow souring, and I would like you to know before we begin that nothing in it is going to hurt. There is no siege here. There is no fire, no massacre, no pestilence, no flood, no wicked lord, no burning of anything at all. What happens in the next 80 years is that a great many small, reasonable, entirely forgivable inconveniences pile up gently on top of one another, the way snow piles on a branch, one soft flake at a time, none of them heavy, none of them cruel, until one perfectly ordinary morning the branch is simply lower than it used to be, and then lower still, and then, without a sound, it is resting on the ground. That is the whole plot of tonight's middle. Snow on a branch. You may drift off in the middle of it and lose nothing at all. So, after Roger, the hill had 2 masters and no master. That was the first thing, and in a way it was the only thing, and everything else that follows is only that one fact wearing different clothes on different days. The castle belonged to the king. It had always belonged to the king, since William the Conqueror had set it on the old Iron Age mound about 1070. But while Roger lived the distinction had hardly mattered, because Roger was the king's chief minister and the bishop of the place at the same time, and a man who is both the crown's right hand and the church's shepherd does not need to work out which of his 2 hats he is wearing on any given afternoon. He simply wore both, and everyone below him arranged their lives around the fact that there was one voice on the hill that settled things. Then that voice stopped in 1139 in the middle of King Stephen's long unhappy war, and the hats came apart. The castle went back to being purely and entirely the king's, held by a royal castellan, a soldier appointed from far away, whose duty was to the crown and whose instinct was to the gate. The cathedral went back to being purely and entirely the bishop's, and the bishop's canons, a body of learned, patient, elderly, book-loving men, whose duty was to the office of the hours and whose instinct was to be left alone. And these two households, the soldiers and the singers, the garrison and the chapter, were set down inside one ring of earth and stone, on a summit of about 56 acres of dry chalk, with one gate between them and the rest of the world, and told by nobody in particular to get along. They very nearly did. That is what I want you to hear. For the better part of a century they very nearly did. There was no war on the hill. There was no bloodshed at the altar, no scandal that England still talks about, no name from old Sarum that comes down to us as a byword for villainy, and that absence is precisely why the story is so restful and so strange. When a place is destroyed, we are given somebody to blame, and blame is a kind of comfort, because it means the thing could have been prevented. Old Sarum offers no such comfort and asks for none. It was not ruined by anybody. It was simply, over 80 or 90 patient years, out-argued by the wind. Let us take the grievances one at a time, slowly, the way the canons themselves took them, because they wrote them down, in the end, in a petition. And the words survive, and the words are traditionally associated with Peter of Blois, a clever, worldly, weary, marvellously articulate churchman of that age who had a gift for putting an ache into a sentence. And the first grievance, the oldest and the largest, and the one that never once let up, was the wind. You have to imagine what that hill is. It is not a mountain. Nobody who lives near mountains would grant it the word hill without a small smile. It is a broad round swelling of chalk, lifted perhaps 100 feet or so above the valley of the Avon, standing out on the open edge of Salisbury Plain, with nothing between it and the weather in any direction whatsoever. No wood, no fold of ground, no taller ridge to take the first shove of a westerly and break it. The Iron Age people who raised the rings there, more than 2,000 years ago, chose the place precisely because it commanded everything, and a place that commands everything is also a place that is available to everything, and what was chiefly available to it 300 days a year was the wind coming off the plain with the whole width of England behind it. Now, a wind on a bare hill is a pleasant thing for about an hour. It is a nuisance for about a week, and it is a slow and grinding sorrow for a lifetime. It never stopped. That is the fact the canons could not get around. It never stopped. It came over the outer bank and dropped into the ditch, and came up the inner bank and struck the walls of the cathedral, and it went round the tower, and it found every gap in every shutter, and it took the candle flames sideways, and it made the door leathers breathe in and out all night like a sleeping animal, and it lifted the chalk dust off the tracks, and laid it politely on everything that anybody owned. In winter it was cold in a way that got into the joints of old men who spent 7 or 8 offices a day standing on a stone floor. In summer it was hot and dry and full of grit. In every season it was loud. And that is the complaint they actually made, and it is the one I find the most touching of all of them, because it is not a complaint about comfort. It is a complaint about work. They said in effect that they could not hear themselves sing. Picture that for a moment, gently, without hurrying. Here is a cathedral. Its entire purpose, its whole reason for existing on that summit at all, is a chain of sung services that runs around the clock, matins in the dark, lauds at first light, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers at dusk, compline before bed, and then round again, day after day, year upon year, decade upon decade, a rope of music paid out continuously by men whose lives are arranged around nothing else. And the wind on that hill was so loud, so constant, so entirely unwilling to take a turn at listening, that the voices went out of the men's mouths and were carried away before they reached the other side of the choir. A cathedral shouting into the weather, 100 trained voices, and the roof full of noise, and the men in the northern stalls unable to hear the men in the southern stalls, and everybody a half-beat adrift, and the whole delicate architecture of the Sarum use, the very chant that this hill had taught to all England, being frayed at the edges every single day by a drought that could not be argued with, could not be excommunicated, could not be sued in any court, and did not want anything, and would not stop. There is a particular kind of tiredness in that. Not drama, tiredness. The tiredness of doing your work well in a room where the work cannot quite be heard. Anyone who has ever tried to talk in a place too loud for talking knows the small daily wearing down of it, and knows that after the first year you simply stop trying to say the interesting things, and after the 5th year you begin, without ever deciding to look at the door. The second grievance was water, and the second grievance is the one that has the joke in it, and the canons knew perfectly well that it had the joke in it, because they were literate men with a sharp sense of the ridiculous, and they put it in the petition on purpose. There was no water on the hill. None, not a spring, not a stream, not a reliable well worth the name. This is the plain physical fact of chalk, and chalk is an honest and uncomplicated material about it. Rain that falls on chalk does not linger and does not run. It goes straight down through the whole white thickness of the stuff, down and down, out of reach, and gathers far below in the body of the rock, and comes out at the foot of the hill in the valley, where it becomes the river, which is exactly where nobody on the summit was standing. So the highest, safest, driest, most commanding place for miles around was also a place where you could not get a cup of water out of the ground with 100 men and 100 years. And so the water came up the hill, every day forever, without exception, in the whole life of that city. Up the track, in barrels, on carts, behind oxen or ponies or men, from the springs and the river down in the valley, jolting and slopping, to the gate and through the gate, and into the courtyards, and into the kitchens and the brewhouse, and the stables and the mason's mortar and the font. Everything drunk on that hill had been carried up it. Everything washed on that hill had been carried up it. Every mouthful given to every horse in that garrison, every bucket for every fire, every drop of the mortar in the great walls that Roger had raised, had come up a slope on a wheel. And it was, unsurprisingly, expensive. Because carting is labour and labour is money, and the men who did it were entitled to be paid. And the price found its own level as prices do. And the complaint, as it comes down to us, is that on the hill of old Sarum water was sold dearer than wine. Sit with that a moment, because it is beautifully absurd, and it is also completely true, and the two facts are not in conflict. Wine had to be shipped from Gascony across the sea in a ship and hauled up from the coast, and it was still cheaper by the cup than a thing that fell out of the sky for nothing and lay glittering in a river you could see from your own window. You could stand on the rampart of the greatest fortress in Wiltshire on a bright afternoon and look down 200 feet or so at as much fresh clean water as the county could want, moving slowly through the meadows, bending round the willows, going quietly off to the sea without you, and you could not have any of it unless somebody put it in a barrel and a horse dragged it up to you and you paid him. The city on the hill was in the plainest sense thirsty in the middle of one of the best watered valleys in England. There is no villain in that. There is only geology being exactly what it is, patiently, for 2,000 years, while men on top of it slowly ran out of arguments. The third grievance was the glare, and this one is easy to miss and worth pausing on, because it tells you what sort of men were making the complaint. Chalk is white. Not off-white. White and old Sarum in those centuries was not the smooth green ring you would see today. It was raw and worked and trodden and dug, with fresh chalk showing everywhere the turf had been broken, on the banks, in the ditches, along the tracks, around the building works that seemed never to have entirely stopped, and the whole summit sat up in the open sky, with no shade on it at all. There were no trees. A hill that windy does not keep trees. There was no wood to sit under, no green shadow in the middle of an afternoon, nowhere for the eye to rest. And in summer, under a high southern English sun, that whole white bowl of a place lit up and threw the light back into your face from every direction at once. Off the ground, off the banks, off the walls, off the dust in the air. A hard, flat, dazzling, head-aching brightness that you could not get out of. And who lived there? Scribes, readers, copyists, old men who had spent 40 years bent over vellum in candlelight and who were expected to keep doing it. Men whose eyes were their whole trade. That is the complaint, and it is not a poetic flourish. It is an occupational injury. The glare of the chalk hurt the eyes of men who could not afford to lose them. There is something very human and very small and very believable about that. Not a howl of outrage. Just several dozen tired clerics, squinting, with headaches, year after year, in a place with nowhere to sit down out of the light. The fourth grievance was the cramping, and the cramping is really a matter of arithmetic. The ring was the ring. It was the size the Iron Age had made it, and the Iron Age had not been consulted about cathedrals. Inside that fixed circle of bank and ditch there now stood a royal castle on its mound, and Bishop Roger's magnificent stone palace within the castle, and a great cathedral with its precinct, and the canons' houses, and the garrison's quarters, and stables and stores and workshops, and a mince memory, and the smiths and the masons and the carters and the servants and the sellers of things, and all their families and all their animals and all their fires and all their smoke and all their noise, packed together in a way that a Norman hilltop simply was not designed to accommodate, since Norman hilltops were designed to hold soldiers and not choirs. There was no room to build, there was no room to grow. If you wanted a garden, there was no soil, only chalk. And no water to put on it, and no shelter to keep the wind from flattening whatever you grew. If you wanted quiet, there was a garrison. If you wanted room for a procession, there was a courtyard. If you wanted the cathedral to be bigger, and by the 1200s a great many people wanted every cathedral to be bigger, because that was the century in which the whole of Europe was falling in love with height and light and glass, then you were out of luck, because the walls of the city were where the Iron Age had put them, and the Iron Age was not answering letters. And the fifth grievance, the one that put the iron into all the others, was the gate. There was one way in. One, on a hilltop like that, ringed by its own defences, there had to be. And the gate, being part of the fortress, was held by soldiers, and the soldiers answered to the castellan, and the castellan answered to the king, and none of them, in any sense that could be written down, answered to the bishop. The gate opened when the garrison opened it, and shut when the garrison shut it. In peace this was a formality that nobody thought about twice. In the long troubled stretches of that century, when there was a war somewhere, or a rumour of a war somewhere, or a castellan who did not care for the bishop, or simply a set of orders from a nervous crown, it stopped being a formality and became the whole shape of a man's day. And so the thing happened that the canons could never quite forgive, and that they wrote down with a very controlled and very audible ache. Churchmen going out from the hill in the ordinary business of their office, to a burial, to a procession, to a manor, to a sick man in a village, would come back up the track in the evening and find the gate shut, and stand there in the wind, in front of their own cathedral, unable to go in. Or the reverse, and in its way it was worse, the gate would be shut behind them, and they would find themselves closed in, unable to go out. A chapter of Christendom's oldest institution kept indoors at the convenience of a sergeant. Not out of malice, most of the time. Out of procedure. Out of the entirely sensible caution of men whose job was to hold a fortress and who therefore held it, and who had no instructions whatever about the feelings of the dean. You can hear the exasperation of it 800 years later, and it is not rage, it is the far more tired thing that comes after rage. And this is where the petition produces the image that everybody remembers, the one line out of the whole long complaint that outlived the men who wrote it and the hill it was written on. They said that the Church of God, up there, was held captive. that it was like the Ark of the Covenant shut up in a profane house. That is the picture. The holiest thing they knew, boxed in a fortress, the sacred kept in a soldier's cupboard, present, protected, honoured after a fashion, and quite unable to get out. A church that was a prisoner in the place that was built to protect it. And this is where I want to be very fair to the soldiers, because it is easy to make them the villains and they were not. Put yourself in the castellan's boots for a moment, up there in the wind with your own set of troubles. You have a royal fortress on the edge of the plain, in a century that keeps producing civil wars. You have a garrison to feed with water that has to be carted. You have walls to keep and a mound to keep and a king somewhere who will hang you if the place falls, and you also have, sharing your one gate and your one courtyard and your one water supply, a large, expensive, immovable, self-important cathedral establishment full of learned men who do not take orders from you, who own half of the summit you are supposed to be defending, who fill your fortress with processions and pilgrims and mourners and merchants at every hour of the day, and who write letters about you to Rome. The garrison found the cannons a nuisance. The cannons found the garrison a nuisance. They were both entirely right. That is the whole quarrel. That is the heart of tonight, and I promised you it would not be exciting. And here it is, and it is not. Two perfectly decent institutions, doing two perfectly necessary jobs, wedged into a space that was really only ever big enough for one of them, being patient with each other for the better part of 100 years, and slowly, kindly, wearily discovering that patience is not the same as a solution. Now let me give you the days themselves, because the days are where the decision actually got made, long before anyone said so out loud. The days went like this. Dark, first. Always dark first. A bell in a cold tower on a black hill, and men getting up out of bed in the small hours as they had done since they were boys, and coming out into a night with a great deal of weather in it, and crossing the yard with a lantern that the wind bullied, and going in under the arch, and standing in their stalls on a floor so cold it came up through the soles, and beginning the night office in a building that was audibly full of moving air. Candle smoke going sideways, the smell of cold stone, which is a real smell, faintly mineral, faintly damp, like the inside of a well. The rooks waking up outside and complaining about it. The sound of the sea in the roof, which was not the sea. Then first light coming grey through the chalk dust on the windows, and the hill turning white again, and the tracks appearing, and the first cart of the day beginning the long, slow pull-up from the valley with the water, the wheels grinding, the ox unhurried, the barrels breathing and slopping, the whole precious ordinary business of drinking arriving on wheels, the way it had arrived on wheels every day for 150 years. The garrison stirring, the gate opening, if the gate was opening, the smiths starting, the masons, who never in the whole life of that city entirely stopped, mixing mortar out of carted water and setting stone into a wall on a summit, where every single ingredient except the chalk itself had come up a hill. Then the day, the offices, one after another, the readings, the copying, the accounts, the tenants, the disputes about a mill in a village 15 miles away, the shading of the eyes on the walk between buildings, the grit, the endless small housekeeping of a great institution, all of it conducted at close quarters with an armed household that was doing something entirely different a few yards away. In the same wind, drinking the same expensive water. And in the evening, the light going long and gold across the plain, which was, and this must be said, one of the loveliest sights in England, because a hill that is punished by weather is also a hill that sees everything, and no one who lived there ever denied that the view was magnificent. And then the gate shutting for the night. And then the wind, taking over completely, as it always did, for the next 9 hours. Do that for a year, and it is a life. Do it for 10 years, and it is a habit. Do it for 80, through 3 generations of cannons, each one arriving as a young man, and hearing from the old men that it had always been like this, and each one growing old in it himself and telling the same thing to the young men who came after. And something starts to happen that is not a rebellion and is not a plot and does not have a date. An idea begins to form, so slowly that nobody can be said to have thought of it, and it is the mildest and most dangerous idea available to any institution, and it goes like this. It does not actually have to be here. That is all. It does not have to be here. The cathedral is not the hill. The sea is not the summit. The saint is not the chalk. The chant is not the wind. The whole enormous apparatus of a bishopric, its bishop, its dean, its canons, its music, its books, its bones, its charters and its purposes, is a thing made of people and habits and permissions. And people and habits and permissions can walk, and things that can walk downhill. Once that thought exists anywhere in a chapter house, it does not go away. It sits at the back of every winter. Every time the gate is shut in somebody's face, it moves an inch forward. Every time a barrel of water costs more than a jug of wine, it moves an inch forward. Every time an old man with ruined eyes squints across a white courtyard, or a choir loses its own singing to a westerly gale, or a mason explains once again that there is simply nowhere left to put anything, the idea shifts a little in its seat and makes itself comfortable, and it does this for decades, quietly, without a leader, until at last it is not an idea at all, it is simply the common sense of the place, and all that is missing is somebody with the standing to say it in the right room. The first man to try was Herbert Poor, who became bishop toward the end of the 1100s, and who wanted, plainly and practically, to take the cathedral off the hill. And he got nowhere, and there is no shame in that, and there was probably no single reason for it either, only the ordinary friction of the world, kings who were busy, a papal court a long way off, war, money, the enormous inertia of a great church that has stood in one place for 120 years, the reasonable conservatism of men who ask, quite fairly, whether the wind is really so bad as all that, and the plain difficulty of persuading anybody that the correct response to a problem is to pick up an entire cathedral city and put it somewhere else. That is not a small ask. It has to be said aloud several times before it stops sounding mad. Herbert Poor said it, and it still sounded mad, and he died with it unsaid enough. But ideas do not die with the men who carry them, they are handed on, usually to somebody in the same family, and Herbert had a brother, and the brother was Richard Poor, and Richard Poor became Bishop of Salisbury in 1217, and with him the thing at last had what it had always lacked, which was not a new argument, because every argument had been made 1,000 times on that summit already, but a man who was patient, well-connected, respected, unhurried, extremely good at Rome, and completely certain. And here is the wider world into which that quiet local decision was about to fall. Because it matters, gently, and then we will let it go for the night. This was the England of King John, and of the long, unhappy end of his reign, and of the great charter sealed in a meadow at Runnymede in 1215, that famous, awkward, practical document in which a king was made to write down that he too lived under the law. And one of the men who stood by that charter, one of its witnesses and sureties, was William Longispie, Earl of Salisbury, an illegitimate son of Henry II and half-brother to King John himself, a great magnate of these very acres, a man who knew this hill as well as he knew his own hands, and who would, in a very few years, kneel in a wet meadow 2 miles south of it and lay a stone. Hold that gently. It is for the next chapter, so there they are, as we leave them, the castle on its mound with the king's men in it, the cathedral beside it with the bishop's men in it, the one gate between them, the chalk shining, the barrels coming up, the wind going over the grass exactly as it had gone over the grass when there was nothing there but a ring of earth and a few Iron Age families keeping an eye on the valley. Nothing has happened. Nothing at all has happened. No blow has been struck, no wall has fallen, no one has been wronged in any way that a court could name. and yet the whole hill is leaning. Every man on it, if you had asked him honestly on a bad February evening with the gate shut and the water dear and his eyes aching and his voice being taken out of his mouth by the weather, would have told you the same thing, and it was not bitter, and it was not angry, and it was barely even a complaint. It was just the truth of the place, arrived at slowly by everybody over 80 years. We could go. We could simply, lawfully, politely go. There is a meadow down there with water in it, and grass, and shelter, and room. The door was not locked. The door had never been locked. It had only taken 100 years for anyone to notice that it opened outward, and that on the other side of it, 2 easy miles away, down a gentle slope, there was a place where a cathedral could hear itself sing. So the hill is leaning toward the door, and tonight, softly, and without the least hurry, it goes through it. There is nothing in this part of the story to startle you. No siege, no fire, no betrayal, no sudden turn of fortune, no one behaving badly in the dark. It is only the account of how a cathedral and a castle and a small crowded town on a windy chalk ring in Wiltshire came, over about 40 patient years, to be a cathedral and a wide flat city 2 miles further south in a green wet meadow, and of how the people who did that did it in broad daylight, with paperwork, at walking pace, in good weather, mostly on foot. If you are already drifting, let yourself drift, because the shape of it is the same at every depth. The city walks downhill. That is the whole of it. It takes about 40 years, it is done politely, and everybody is fine. Bishop Richard Poore had come to the See of Salisbury in 1217, and he came to it already knowing exactly what he wanted, which is a rare and rather restful thing in a bishop. His brother Herbert Poore had held the same seat before him, and had wanted the same thing, and had got nowhere at all with it, and had died with the idea still sitting unfinished on the hill like a cart with a broken axle. Richard picked the idea up where his brother had set it down, and carried it, and the difference between the 2 brothers was not vision, because they had the same vision, and it was not will, because they both had plenty. The difference was simply that Richard came along at a moment when England was tired, and when the men who could say no were busy with larger and unhappier things, and when a bishop asking to move his cathedral 2 miles into a meadow was, in the great scale of the kingdom's troubles, an almost pleasant request to be able to grant. So he wrote to Rome. That is the first thing to hold on to about this move, and it is the thing that makes it so unlike every other lost city you have ever heard of. It began with a letter. Not with an army, not with a fever, not with the sea coming in over the fields at night, but with a bishop sitting in a cold stone room on a windy hill, with a candle guttering sideways in the draught from a shutter, dictating a careful and respectful and rather beautifully argued letter to the Pope, explaining that the Church of God on this hill was a captive in a fortress, that the wind was so loud his cannons could not hear their own singing, that there was no water on the summit, and that what water there was cost more than wine, that the white glare of the chalk was blinding the eyes of men who spent their whole lives reading small letters by small light, and that on the whole it might be better for everyone if the cathedral were somewhere else. And in 1218, Pope Honorius III, sitting a very long way away in a city, with a great deal of water in it, and no chalk glare to speak of, read the request, or had it read to him, and granted the license. Just like that. A short document, a seal, a rider, a road, a boat, a road again, and the permission comes back up the hill in a satchel, and a cathedral is free to walk. Consider the quiet enormity of that in the softest possible way, and then let it go. A cathedral is not a tent. A cathedral is the single least portable object a medieval society could make. It is thousands of tons of quarried stone lifted into the air on purpose, and it is also the whole apparatus of a diocese, the bishop and the dean and the canons and the vicars and the choristers, the books, the vestments, the relics, the shrine of a saint, the school, the deeds, the rents, the memory, and all of it had been sitting on that hilltop for nearly 150 years, and had every appearance of sitting there forever. And a single sheet of parchment from Italy said that it could be somewhere else instead, and so in the end, it was. Empires have fallen with more noise and less effect. Now, the meadow. 2 miles south of the ring, down where the land gives up being a chalk down and becomes a flat and generous flood plain, the River Avon comes gently along, and it is joined there by the Nadder, and near enough by the Bourne and the Wylye too, so that the whole floor of the valley is a soft braided green place of running water and slow water and standing water, and the kind of grass that only grows where the ground is never truly dry. It is the exact opposite of the hill in every particular. The hill was high, this is low. The hill was dry, this is wet in a way that would be a nuisance if it were not such a blessing. The hill had wind that came from the whole width of Salisbury Plain, with nothing in the way of it, and this has a soft moving air that stirs the willows and then thinks better of it and stops. The hill had chalk glare and no shade, and this has trees. The hill had a ring of walls and a locked gate and no room to build so much as a woodshed, and this has room in every direction, room without limit, meadow after meadow after meadow, level and quiet and unclaimed by anybody except. As it happened, the bishop himself, who owned a good deal of it, which is the sort of coincidence that makes an ecclesiastical decision run remarkably smoothly. And there is a legend about how the spot was chosen, and it is a lovely legend, and we should tell it properly, because it has been told for 800 years, and it has earned its place, and because it is exactly the kind of thing a mind likes to hold on the way down into sleep. The story goes that the bishop, or in some tellings a soldier, or in the best tellings an archer of the garrison who was for once being useful, stood on the ramparts of old Sarum with a great bow, and drew it, and loosed one arrow out into the south, and said that wherever it fell, there the new cathedral would rise. And the arrow flew, and it came down 2 miles away in the water meadow by the Avon, and they built the church on the spot where it stuck in the turf. In one version it strikes a deer, and the deer runs on and dies in the meadow, and they build there instead, which is a slightly more plausible arrangement and a slightly sadder one. Now, no arrow has ever flown 2 miles. No arrow has ever flown a quarter of that. A very strong man with a very good longbow on a very good day, standing on a high rampart with the wind behind him and God in a generous mood, might send a light shaft something over 300 yards, and would then sit down and be tired. And the cathedral would have been founded in the middle of the outer bailey among the sheep, which would rather have defeated the purpose. So the arrow did not happen. What happened instead was land, and water, and law, and a bishop who owned a meadow, and a survey, and a conversation, and the dull good sense of choosing the flattest, wettest, emptiest, most sheltered piece of ground within an easy walk of the old place. And that is far duller than an arrow, and far more likely. And it also worked, which the arrow would not have done, but the legend keeps being told, and it deserves to be, because it is the story people wanted, and because there is something in us that would always rather a great city were begun by a single beautiful gesture than by a competent man reading a rent roll. Both things are true at once. The arrow is not true, and the arrow is the truest thing about the whole business, which is that they were choosing freely where to live, and that is a kind of shot into the future whether you use a bow or not. In 1219, before any great stone was laid, they made the first small mark on the meadow, and it is my favourite part of this whole night, and it is very small. They built a chapel of wood, a wooden chapel, in a wet field, in the rain, with the old cathedral still standing whole and roofed and singing 2 miles away up on its ring, and they consecrated a cemetery beside it. That was the new city's first breath, and it is worth resting on for a moment before we go any further, because it tells you what kind of people these were, and what kind of move this was. They did not begin with a wall, they did not begin with a gate, or a keep, or a bank, or a ditch, or any of the 1,000 things that the hill had begun with 1,000 years before, because the hill had been made by frightened people who needed to be high up and hard to reach. They began with a place to pray and a place to bury the dead, in a flat open field with no defence of any kind, in the middle of a kingdom that had just finished a civil war. That is the whole difference between the old city and the new one, expressed in wood, in one wet year. The hill was a place to be safe in, the meadow was a place to live in, and the first two things a living place needs are somewhere to sing and somewhere to lie down. Then the 28th of April, in 1220. A spring day in the water meadows, the willows just coming into that soft acid green they only manage for about 10 days in the year, the grass wet to the ankle, the Avon going by with its usual complete lack of interest in human affairs, larks somewhere up above making the noise larks make, and a considerable crowd standing about in a field. Because the bishop is going to lay the foundation stones of a cathedral, and nobody in that meadow has ever seen such a thing done before, and nobody there will see it done again. 5 stones were laid. Not 1. 5, and this is one of those details that historians file quietly and that the rest of us should sit with for a moment in the dark, because the number is the message. The first stone was laid for the Pope, Honorius III, who had given the licence and who was in Rome and would never see the place. The second was laid for the Archbishop of Canterbury. The third the bishop laid for himself, Richard Poor, the man who had asked. And the fourth and the fifth were laid by William Longaysby, Earl of Salisbury, and by his Countess, Ela. Say those 2 names softly, because they are worth keeping. William Longaysby, whose name means long sword, was the natural son of Henry II, and the half-brother of King John. And he had stood as one of the sureties of Magna Carta in 1215, which is to say that when the barons and the king finally sat down in a meadow at Runnymede and agreed in writing that the king was not the weather, this man's name was among those who guaranteed it. And now, 5 years later, here he is in another meadow, kneeling in wet grass, setting a stone in the ground for a church. It is the same man doing the same kind of thing twice, and both times in a field by a river, and both times the thing he is doing outlives him by 800 years and counting. And beside him Ela, Countess of Salisbury in her own right, who had inherited the whole earldom as a small girl and held it, and who later founded an abbey at Laycock and became its abbess and ran it for many years, which is a whole other night's story and a good one. The 2 of them lay a stone each, and so a cathedral begins with 5 stones and no walls, and a wooden chapel and a field. Now the long, calm, marvellous descent. This is the part that nobody ever quite pictures properly, and it is the part most worth picturing as you go under. For a generation, 2 cathedrals existed at the same time. The old one stood up on the ring, complete, roofed, consecrated, with St. Osmund's shrine in it and the wind howling round it exactly as it always had, and the new one lay down in the meadow, growing upward out of the mud 1 course of stone at a time, and for years the second was much the uglier of the 2, being a building site with a chapel in the corner of it, and the people looked from one to the other, and slowly, 1 household at a time, made up their minds. Nobody was driven down that hill. That is the thing to hold. No fire came through the town on the ring, no soldier put anybody out of a door, no plague emptied the lanes, no decree ordered anyone anywhere. The canons went first, naturally, because the canons had to, and they built themselves houses down in the meadow around the works, and the houses were better than the ones they had left, because everything in the meadow was better than everything on the hill. Then the masons went, because the masons were where the work was, and the work was now down there and would be down there for 100 years, which is a good long career and enough for 3 generations of one family. Then the carters and the smiths who followed the masons, because masons need iron and masons need carts. Then the traders who followed the carters, because the trade of any town is really the trade of its roads, and the roads had begun, quietly and of their own accord, to bend toward the meadow. Then the innkeepers, who follow everybody, and who have never in the history of the world been late to anything. then the servants and the labourers and the widows and the boys with nothing much to do, and then, without anyone quite noticing the day it happened, simply everyone. Picture it at the pace it truly went, which is the pace of a walking man with a handcart. The family on the hill, one particular family, in one particular year, looks around a small cold house inside a ring of walls where the water comes up by barrel and costs more than it should, and where the gate is shut at the garrison's convenience, and where the wind takes the thatch every third winter, and they look down 2 miles to a flat green place where there is a new church rising and new, streets being pegged out, and water running past the door for nothing, and they do the arithmetic that every family in every age has done, and they take the door off its hinges, because a door is a valuable thing and doors were taken, and they put it on a cart with the pots and the bedding and the salt and the chickens, and they walk down. It takes an hour. It is not an exodus. There is no dust cloud and no lamentation, and nobody looks back at the skyline with a hand shading their eyes. It is a family moving house, on a Tuesday, and it happened perhaps 200 or 300 times over about 50 years, and the sum of all those Tuesdays is that a city changed place. That is how cities actually move, when they move, not in a night, but in a slow drizzle of ordinary decisions, each one of which was obviously sensible, and none of which was the decision. And up on the hill, meanwhile, the lanes get quieter, and the empty houses get taken apart for their timber by the neighbours who are still there, and then those neighbours go too, and the wind gets more and more of the place to itself, and gets exactly what it always wanted, which was everything, and finds, as winners often do, that it does not much enjoy it. William Longaspie did not have long to watch it. He died in 1226, 6 years after he knelt in the grass with his stone, and he was buried in the new cathedral, the first person ever laid in it, in a building that was still a shell with the sky in most of it, and his tomb is there still, in the nave, with his shield and his long painted surcoat, and 800 years of people have walked past it, and he is where he put himself, in the field he chose to kneel in. There is something very restful about that. Most of the great men of that century are lost, or moved, or scattered, or under a car park somewhere. This one is exactly where he lay down. Then, in 1227, Henry III gave the new place its charter, and the name on that charter is worth hearing properly, because it is still the legal name of the city today, and almost nobody who lives there ever uses it. The charter is for New Sarum, not for Salisbury. New Sarum. The old name, from the old hill, from the old misread abbreviation of Sarisbury, carried down the slope on a cart with the pots and the doors, and set up again in the meadow with the word new stuck on the front of it, the way a family moving house takes the name of the farm with them. And so to this day, in every formal document, in every deed and writ and charter, the city with the tallest spire in Britain is called New Sarum, which means it is still, officially and forever, defined by a hill it left 800 years ago and where nobody has lived since. With the charter came a market, and fairs and rights, and the freedom of a proper borough. And with the freedom came the layout, and this is the loveliest small triumph of the whole story, and it is the exact revenge of a thirsty city. They laid the new place out flat. On a grid, deliberately, straight streets crossing straight streets, in generous rectangles that they called checkers, each one a block, and the blocks had room in them, room for a house, and a yard, and a garden, and a tree, and around them and through them they ran water. Open channels of clear river water down the middle of the streets, brought off the Avon, running past every door, day and night. For nothing, forever, think about that for a moment, gently, and then let it go. These were the descendants of people who had bought water by the barrel at the top of a chalk hill at a price that made wine look reasonable. And when they got to build their own city from nothing, on flat ground with no one to stop them, the very first thing they did, before beauty, before defence, before anything, was to run water through every single street where everybody could see it. They did not need it in the middle of the road. They could have piped it and hidden it. They put it where you could hear it. A city that had been thirsty for 150 years built itself a home where you could not walk to church without crossing running water 3 times. The streets were nicknamed the Venice of England later by people who had never been to Venice and did not much care. The channels were finally covered over only in the 1800s, when a rather humorless age decided that open water in a street was a health matter rather than a memory, and they were right, and it was still a pity. And the cathedral rose. It rose fast, which is the other thing that almost nobody says about it, and it is the reason the building looks the way it does. Nearly every other great cathedral in England is a splendid quarrel between 4 centuries, with a Norman bit at one end and a Gothic bit at the other, and a perpendicular afterthought on top, because they took 300 years and every generation changed its mind. Salisbury did not. Salisbury was begun in a field in 1220, and the main body of it was finished in about 38 years, in one style, by people who all agreed, because they had the one thing no other cathedral builders in England ever had, which was a completely empty site and a completely clear head. The eastern chapels were consecrated in 1225, only 5 years in, and services began there while the west end was still open grass and scaffolding. And on the 30th of September, in 1258, the whole cathedral was consecrated, in the presence of the king, in the meadow that had been a field within living memory of men still alive that morning. Some of the older people standing in that new nave had been born in a house on the hill. They had walked down as children behind a cart with a door on it, and now they were standing under a stone vault in a finished cathedral, in a city with water running down the middle of its streets, 2 miles from where they were born, in a place that had not existed when they were. That is not a tragedy. It is very nearly the opposite. It is the single most hopeful thing in this entire long story, and it is the reason we tell it at night rather than in daylight. And what, all this while, was happening up on the hill? Very little, and that is the joke, and it is a dry one, and it takes about 40 years to land. The garrison stayed. The castle stayed. The king's soldiers who had held the gate and who had shut the cannons out in the wet, and who had made the whole hilltop such an unrestful place to keep a choir, won their long argument completely and utterly, and were left standing in a ring of walls with absolutely nothing inside it to guard. They had wanted the hill to themselves, more or less, in the vague way that soldiers want a fortress uncluttered by clergy, and they got it, and then they got rather more of it than they had bargained for, because when the clergy went the town went after them, and when the town went the trade went, and when the trade went there was no reason for anyone to come up that slope at all, except to look at the view, which is very good, and which does not pay for a garrison. So the gate they had been so careful about closing now opened and shut on an emptying lane, and the men who had held the keys to a place nobody wished to enter. Nobody had beaten them. They simply found, one quiet decade at a time, that the thing they had been guarding had walked out from under them, and that a fortress with nothing in it is only a very expensive wall. And it must be said, in fairness and in the softest possible voice, that they had not been villains either. They had been doing their job, which was to hold a royal castle, and holding a royal castle means controlling the gate, and controlling the gate means that somebody, sooner or later, is going to be standing on the wrong side of it in the rain in a good cope. There was no wickedness on that hill. There was only a castle and a cathedral trying to be the same size as each other inside a circle that was too small for either, and 150 years of 2 entirely reasonable institutions being reasonable at each other, until one of them, very courteously, left. And now the last soft turn of this chapter, the one that closes the loop we opened at dusk on an empty ring. The old cathedral, up on the hill, was not left to fall. It was taken down. Carefully and lawfully, and by licence, and over years, the great church of Bishop Herman and St. Osmond and Bishop Roger was unbuilt, stone by dressed stone, and lowered and loaded and brought down the slope on carts, the same slope the families had walked down with their pots and their chickens. And the stones went into the new city, and a very great many of them went into one particular thing. They went into the wall. The wall around the close, the wide green precinct that surrounds Salisbury Cathedral, that long low grey boundary with its gates that are shut at night to this day, is very largely built out of the old cathedral on the hill, which means if you stand in the close in the evening, with the spire above you and the grass under you and the rooks going home, that you are standing inside the old church and looking at the new one at the same time. The first cathedral is not gone. It is simply lying down around the second one, in pieces, in a ring, holding it. Exactly the way the old chalk ring on the hill used to hold everything, in a circle with a gate. The old church came down the hill and became a wall around its own child, and it is still on duty, and it has been on duty for 700 years, and it will be there in the morning. So the empty ring you saw at the start of tonight, out there in the dusk with the mist in the ditches and the sheep on the vanished nave, is not a ruin at all, and it never was one. Nothing died up there. A ruin is a place where something ended. This is only a house whose family moved somewhere better, and took the good doors with them, and took the stones, and took the name, and took the saint, and took the singing, and left the door open behind them, because there was nobody left to shut it, and nothing left inside worth shutting in. And down in the meadow, 2 miles away, in the flat, wet, generous green, the thing they carried is still standing, still roofed, still lit, still singing, with water in the streets around it and a wall of the old hill around that. Sleep now, if you like. The move is done. It took 40 years, and it hurt nobody. The stones are down the hill. The water is running past every door. The wind-up on the ring is still going round and round the empty circle looking for someone to argue with, and it has 800 years to wait. And there is nobody coming, and it does not know that yet. And so for a little while there were 2 Salisburys in Wiltshire at the same time, which is a strange and rather gentle thing to picture as you lie there in the dark, the old one up on its great ring of chalk, thinning out year by year, going quiet room by quiet room, and the new one down in the water meadows 2 miles south, filling up, spreading out, learning its own streets, with the smell of new mortar on the damp air and the rivers running softly through the middle of it. All. Nobody drew a line under the old city. Nobody announced its ending. There was no last day, no final horn, no gate closed for the final time with any ceremony at all. There was only a long, slow, entirely reasonable leaving, spread across 300 years and something like 10 generations, so gradual that no single person who ever lived on that hill ever saw the city go. Each of them only saw a few more houses empty than the year before, and thought little of it, and got on with the day. That is how cities actually end, most of the time. Not in fire. In furniture. In one cart at a time, going downhill, in no particular hurry, with a chair tied on the back of it. Down in the meadow, the new city was doing what the hill had never been able to let it do, which was simply to grow. Salisbury had been laid out flat and generous and hopeful, on a neat grid of streets in tidy squares that the medieval mind called checkers, with clean water led along channels down the middle of the roadways, so that a household could dip a bucket from its own doorstep, rather than buy a barrel from a man with a cart and a monopoly and an opinion about the price. There was room. That was the great luxury of the place, and the whole point of it, and after the hill it must have felt almost extravagant. Room for gardens, room for orchards, room for a market square you could get lost in, room for a new house on the end of a row without asking anybody's permission or knocking anybody else's down. The wool came in from the downs, and the cloth trade took hold, and Salisbury grew rich in that steady, unglamorous, deeply English way, on sheep and weaving and water and the fact that everything the region carried had to pass through it. And there is a small, quiet pleasure in noticing what did the enriching. Because the wool that made Salisbury rich came off the backs of the sheep of Salisbury Plain, which is to say off the very same downs, and very possibly off the very same hill that the city had just walked away from. The sheep stayed up top, where the grass was good and the wind was somebody else's problem. The people came down to the water, where the fulling and the dyeing and the washing needed rivers, and rivers, as everyone had painfully learned, do not climb. So the arrangement settled itself into something almost comic in its neatness. The animals kept the high, dry, windy places, the humans took the low, wet, sheltered ones. The wool travelled down the slope in one direction and the money travelled about in the other, and everybody, including the sheep, was better off than before. It took the hill 100 years of argument and a papal licence to arrive at what any shepherd could have told them in an afternoon. By the 14th century it was one of the largest and wealthiest towns in the kingdom. A city of merchants and weavers and dyers and fullers and innkeepers and canons, all living where a bishop's meadow had been within living memory. And the cathedral in the middle of it, that pale, astonishing thing, raised in a single lifetime in one single unbroken style, because they had built it all at once and never had to argue with anything already standing there, was already becoming what it has been ever since, the loveliest building of its kind in the country, standing in the greenest close in the country, with rooks turning above it and the grass going right up to its feet. And then, between about 1310 and 1330, in a burst of confidence that seems almost unreasonable when you consider what they were standing on, the people of Salisbury did the most extraordinary thing of the whole story. They built the spire. They had a cathedral already, complete, consecrated, finished, entirely sufficient, sitting there in its meadow doing exactly what a cathedral is asked to do. And they looked at it, and they decided that what it needed was a tower on top of it, and then a spire on top of the tower, and then more spire, and then a little more, until it went up 404 feet into the Wiltshire sky and became the tallest church spire in Britain, the tallest then and, after 700 years of everybody else having a go, still the tallest today. They did this on a foundation about 4 feet deep. 4 feet. In a water meadow. The stonework of that tower and spire weighs something in the order of 6,000 tons, and they set it down on marshy ground on footings you could dig out with an afternoon and a decent spade, and it has stood there ever since, leaning a little, watched anxiously by every generation of masons since the 1400s, held together by iron ties and timber scaffolding left inside it, and, one suspects, by sheer collective embarrassment at the thought of it falling. It has not fallen. It is not going to fall tonight. You may let go of that worry. If you had picked it up, it has been not falling for 7 centuries, and it is very good at it by now, and it does not need you to hold it up. But here is the part of it that belongs to this chapter, and it is the part I would like you to carry down with you towards sleep, because it is the quiet joke at the centre of the whole night. That spire, the tallest thing in Britain, the pale needle that people drive across 3 counties to look at, was built by the city that came off the hill. It was built by the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the canons who could not hear themselves sing up on old Sarum for the noise of the wind, by the descendants of masons who had carried water up a chalk slope in barrels because there was none at the top, by the sons of families who had walked downhill with their household goods on a cart. And it was built after the old city had already left. The hill city's greatest achievement was not achieved on the hill. It was achieved 2 miles away, at ground level, in a wet field, by people who no longer lived where their story started, and who put up, on soft ground with no foundations to speak of, the highest thing in the country. A needle you can see from the ramparts of the place they left, standing exactly where the old city said it was going. That is not loss. That is a family that moved house, and then, having moved, did the best work of its life. And everything else the old city cared about had come down with it, which is worth dwelling on for a moment while the lamp is low. The singing came down. The Sarum use, which St. Osmond had shaped up on the windy hill where nobody could hear a note of it, went on from the new cathedral in the meadow and spread further than ever until nearly every parish in England and Wales and Ireland was keeping its feasts and singing its chants in the order that a small hilltop had worked out, and it went on doing so for 400 years, which is a long career for anything, and longer than most kingdoms manage. The books came down, quill by quill and chest by chest. The relics came down. Osmond himself came down, or what was left of him, carried 2 miles in his coffin like everybody else, and laid in the new church he never saw, and there he waited with great patience for the rest of his story. He was not made a saint until 1457, nearly 4 centuries after his death, one of the very few Englishmen the medieval church ever canonized, and by then the hill he had built his cathedral on was more sheep than city, and the joke was already fully formed. His shrine became one of the great pilgrim places of the south, in a cathedral in a meadow, in a city that existed because his own canons could not stand living where he had put them. And the name came down too, and this is my favourite of all of them, and the smallest. Sarum, that odd, clipped, slightly wrong little word, which was never anybody's real name for anything, but only a scribe's abbreviation of Saraspiri, misread by somebody in a hurry, and then copied by everybody else forever afterwards, walked down the hill with the carts and settled in the meadow and never left. The bishops are still bishops of Salisbury and still sign themselves in the Sarum style. The liturgy is still the Sarum use. The new city's formal legal name, to this day on the oldest and most serious paperwork, is New Sarum, which quietly means that a city of 40-odd thousand people has spent 800 years describing itself, without embarrassment, as the newer version of an empty field. Meanwhile, up on the ring, the emptying went on, unhurried and undramatic, and almost nobody noticed. The castle was still the king's. That did not change. On parchment it stayed royal for a very long time. It was a fortress, and a prison, and now and then a lodging for a king passing through on his way to hunt somewhere better. And there was a constable, and a small garrison, and the gate was still shut at night out of habit, long after there was nothing much left inside worth shutting a gate on. But the kings came less. That is the whole of the castle's decline, really. Said in 4 words, the kings came less. A castle is not a building so much as an argument about where power is, and when power is elsewhere the argument goes quiet, and quiet buildings are expensive. It had been built to hold down a conquered country, and the country had long since stopped needing holding down at that particular spot. The roads had shifted, the trade had shifted, the bishop had gone downhill, the people had followed the bishop, and a royal fortress on a hill above an empty town has, in practical terms, nothing to be a fortress about. So the visits thinned to occasional, the occasional thinned to rare, the rare thinned to never, and nobody wrote down which year the never began. Through the 14th century and the 15th, the Great Slow Undoing did what it always does, which is to start with roofs. It is always the roof. A stone building with a sound roof will stand for 1,000 years and outlive everyone who ever complained about the draught. A stone building with a hole in the roof has perhaps 30 years of dignity left in it, and then it is a heap with a view. Lead was valuable, and lead came off. Timber was valuable, and timber came out. Rain got in and sat in the joints of the walls through the winter, and froze, and did the patient arithmetic that frost does, and in the spring a little more mortar was sand. The garrison thinned to a handful, and the handful thinned to a caretaker, and the caretaker was probably a man with sheep, who found the arrangement convenient, and the rent agreeable, and the ghosts entirely bearable. Surveys of the castle in these years read like a doctor's notes on a very old and very comfortable patient, this tower ruinous, that hall decayed, the chapel wanting repair, the whole in need of more money than anyone intends to spend on it. Nobody was neglecting it out of malice. Everybody simply had somewhere better to put the money, and that somewhere was 2 miles downhill and going up fast. It kept a little work, in the way that old buildings do when nobody has decided about them. It was a prison for a while, and there is something very restful about a prison on a hill with nothing round it. Because there was nowhere at all for anybody to run to, and everyone concerned could see that plainly, and one imagines the arrangement was conducted with a certain mutual courtesy. It held stores. It held records. It held a constable with a title much larger than his duties, who walked the walls once a day out of self-respect and looked at the weather and looked at the spire coming up in the distance, year by year, taller each time he counted, and went in again. Sheep were pastured in the bailey, quite officially, because grass is grass and the king's grass is worth a rent. Somebody kept doves. Somebody had a garden in the corner of a courtyard, where a Chancellor of England had once received the great men of the kingdom, and grew in all likelihood onions, and the palace that Bishop Roger raised, the finest domestic stonework in the county, with its courtyard and its fine windows and its cut arcades that had cost more than most towns were worth, stood empty and let the rain in, and the rooks got into the roof and did what rooks do, and no one thought it remarkable enough to write a single line about. And then, in 1327, there came the tidiest and most touching act of the entire story, and it happened on paper, in the driest possible language, as the best things often do. A royal licence was granted to the Dean and Chapter of Salisbury, allowing them to take the stone of the old cathedral up on the hill, the abandoned one, the one Bishop Herman began and St. Osmond finished, and the lightning corrected, and Bishop Roger doubled in size, and to carry it down and use it to build the wall around the close of the new cathedral in the meadow. So they took it down. Course by course, cart by cart, over years, the great church came off the hill in pieces, went down the slope it had spent 150 years looking down, and was set up again around its own child. The old cathedral is still standing. That is the thing worth knowing. It is not gone, it is not lost, it was not destroyed. It is simply lying down and holding hands in a long low line around the green at Salisbury, and if you walk along the closed wall today and put your palm flat on the stone, you are touching the walls that heard the very first singing of the Sarum use, laid out end to end in the grass, keeping the sheep out and the quiet in. A cathedral that became a garden wall for the cathedral that replaced it. There is no grander retirement available to a building anywhere in England. And the little town inside the ramparts, the houses and the workshops and the alehouse and the smithy that had grown up in the shelter of the castle because a cathedral and a garrison together need feeding and shoeing and mending, went out the same way, not in a night, but house by house, family by family, sensibly, undramatically, with everybody making the same small private decision at slightly different times over about 200 years. There is no work up here any more. There is no water up here, and there never was. My sister is down in the meadow, and my trade is down in the meadow, and the market is down in the meadow, and the bishop is down in the meadow, and I am 40 and my knees have opinions about this hill. So a family would take the door off its hinges, because a good door was worth taking, and the shutters, because good shutters were worth taking, and pull the roof timbers down and stack them on a cart, because seasoned oak was worth more than the walls it sat on, and go down the slope with the dog running ahead. And the neighbours would watch them go and think about it. And a year later, or 5 or 20, the neighbours would do the same. And each empty house made the next family's decision a little easier, because a street with 3 gaps in it is a street with an argument in it, and the argument only ever went one way. The chalk ring did not empty like a jug, it emptied like a tide going out, so slowly that you have to sit and watch the same stone for an hour to be sure the water is even moving. In 1514, Henry VIII, who had a gift for finding value in things other people had stopped looking at, sold off what was left of the castle, not the castle exactly, but its materials, its stone, its usefulness, granted away to a man named Thomas Compton, and after that the last hard edges of the place went off in carts as well. This is where the story becomes almost funny. In the dry way this hill has always been funny. The mightiest royal fortress in Wiltshire, raised by William the Conqueror on the ring that the Iron Age raised. The hill where the great men of England swore their oath, where the Domesday Book came to rest, where a bishop who ran the kingdom built himself a palace of dressed stone with courtyards and fine windows, ended up as somebody's barn, and somebody's field wall, and somebody's byre, and somebody's cottage doorstep, and a good solid lintel over a farmhouse hearth 8 miles away, where it presumably still is, holding up a chimney and saying nothing about it. There are villages all round that country with old Sarum quietly built into them. Nobody stole the city. Everybody just borrowed it, permanently, with the paperwork in order, and put it to use. Because it was good stone, beautifully cut, sitting in a heap on a hill nobody lived on, and it would have been an offence against Wiltshire common sense to leave it there. The city was not so much abandoned as gently recycled, which is a much kinder ending than most cities are given, and which means that old Sarum did not vanish at all. It was distributed. And then the grass came, and the grass was patient, and the grass won. Watch it happen slowly, because it happened slowly, and because slow things are what we came here for. First the mortar softens, because mortar is only lime and sand and time, and the rain on chalk is a soft rain that gets into everything and never seems to be trying. Then the topmost flint courses, no longer bound, begin to lean, and a lean becomes a slip, and a slip becomes a small landslide of small stones tumbling down into the great ditch, where they lie and are gradually covered. Then the seeds arrive, brought in by birds and wind and the undersides of sheep, and elder comes up in the corners, because elder always comes up in the corners, and thorn takes the banks, and nettle takes the middens where the kitchens were, because nettle can smell an old kitchen a century later and comes to see what is left. Rabbits find that a Norman rampart is the finest digging in the county, and set about it, and there spoil heaps of white chalk trickle down the green like spilled flour. Moles work the nave. Sheep discover what sheep always discover, which is that a cathedral floor makes excellent grazing, level and drained and sheltered, the best pasture on the whole hilltop, and they crop it close and keep it close and go on cropping it for 500 years, so that the grass over St. Osmund's Church is the smoothest and finest turf in Wiltshire, mown continuously and free of charge by animals who have no opinion whatever on the Sarum use. Chalk dust settles. Rain washes the mortar white and then washes it away. Every winter the ditches fill with mist, and the mist sits in them all night the way it did before any of this began, and lifts in the morning the way it did before any of this began. And the wind, which had won the whole argument, which had shouted down a choir and driven out a bishop, and beaten a cathedral establishment 2 miles down a hill through the sheer relentless application of weather, went on doing exactly what it had always done, at exactly the same volume, over the same grass in the same direction, forever. Only now there was nobody left to shout at. It had won so completely that it had nothing to argue with. It is still up there, if you go. It has not learned a thing, and it is not sorry. And the ditches, which were dug by hand out of the chalk more than 2,000 years ago by people whose names and language and gods are entirely gone, and which are the oldest thing on that hill and will be the last thing on it, simply went on being ditches, softening a little at the lip each century, filling a little at the bottom, holding their mist, holding their shade, holding their sheep out of the weather on bad nights, exactly as they had held Iron Age cattle and Roman carts and Saxon spearmen and Norman masons and a bishop's household and the wheels of the last cart of stone. Everything that hill ever did came and went inside those ditches, and the ditches did not notice any of it. That is the proper scale of the thing, and it is a very good scale to fall asleep inside. A cathedral is a long time to us, and no time at all to a bank of chalk. Grass over stone, stone over chalk, chalk over the quiet dark, and all of it going nowhere, in no hurry, forever. By the 1600s there was nothing at all. That is the sentence, and I want to say it plainly and softly and let it sit there in the dark with you, because it is the whole of this chapter and the whole of this hill. Nothing at all. No cathedral, no castle, no bishop, no canons, no garrison, no constable, no mint, no market, no alehouse, no smithy, no houses, no streets, no people. 56 acres of the most historically loaded ground in southern England, and on it, grass, sheep, rabbits, rooks, thistles, chalk, wind, and a truly magnificent view. A traveller riding up in the reign of the first Elizabeth or the first James would have found a bare green ring of enormous smooth banks and enormous smooth ditches with a raised mound in the middle and absolutely no reason to dismount. If a shepherd had told him that this had been a cathedral city with a royal castle and a bishop and a mint and a saint and its own way of singing that the whole of England had once copied, he would have looked at the sheep and the thistles and been forgiven for wondering whether the shepherd had been at something. And yet let us set the accounts out properly, because this hill deserves a fair reckoning before we let it sleep. Old Sarum was never conquered. In the whole of its long life, from the Iron Age to the sheep, no army ever took it. It was never sacked, unlike poor Wilton down the road. It was never burned. It was never plagued out. It was never drowned, never buried under sand or ash, never swallowed by the sea, never earthquaked, never put to the sword, never even besieged to any purpose worth writing down. It suffered not one of the deaths that lost cities are supposed to suffer, not one of the deaths that make a good story. It was outvoted by the weather, out-argued by thirst, inconvenienced by a locked gate, and then removed respectfully in wheelbarrows by its own inhabitants, with a licence from the Crown and a licence from the Pope, and everything properly signed. A hill that had held the King of England, the Bishop of half the South, the Mint, the Oath, and, as the canons themselves once put it, the Ark of God, now held about 40 sheep, and a very good view of somewhere else. And the sheep, it should be said, seemed content with the arrangement and have raised no petition to Rome about it in 500 years. So there it is, and there it lies, and there you may leave it, the ring perfectly empty and perfectly peaceful, smooth as a thumbprint on the chalk, holding its mist in the ditches at dusk, holding its rooks in the evening, holding nothing else at all, while 2 miles off across the flat green fields, the spire that the vanished city built stands up in the last of the light and quietly gets on with being the tallest thing in Britain. The hill is finished. The hill is at rest. The hill has been, at last, allowed to be what it always really was underneath all that ambition, which is a big quiet piece of Wiltshire with a lot of sky over it. Except for one thing. And I will tell you plainly now, gently, with no shock in it, and nothing withheld, because that is how we do things here, and because you may well be nearly asleep, and I would not dream of startling you. On paper, in law, in the careful, unhurried ledgers of the kingdom, this empty field was still a town. It had been made a parliamentary borough away back around 1295, in the days when it had streets and citizens and a reason, and nobody had ever got round to unmaking it. Boroughs, once made, were rather like the wind up there, they simply went on. And so this hill of grass and rabbits and sheep and mist, this hill with no houses on it, no roads on it, no wells, no church, no shops and no inhabitants whatsoever, retained, in full and undisputed law, the ancient and honourable right to send 2 members of Parliament to Westminster. 2, not 1. 2 men, in good coats, sitting in the Commons, speaking and voting on behalf of the sovereign will of a field. And it went on doing this, calmly, legally, and with the most beautiful ceremony under an elm tree for another 500 years. But that, and the tree, and the 7 or so men who owned invisible plots of nothing at all, and the very famous young man whose whole career began on this empty hill, is all for tomorrow, or for later, or for never, whichever you like best. Let it go now. Let the ring go dark and green and quiet under its mist. Let the sheep settle in the ditch out of the wind. Let the last cart of stone go down the slope and out of sight. Nothing more is going to happen up here for 100 years, and nothing needs you to watch it. Rest, and so we come to the last part of the night, and to the last part of the hill, and it is, I think, the gentlest part of all, because nothing else is going to happen to old Sarum now, Everything that could be carried away has been carried away. The cathedral went down the hill on carts, the castle went into barns and field walls all over Wiltshire. The people went of their own accord, family by family, over so many years that no one alive ever watched a city leave. What is left is grass, smooth, close-cropped, sheep-shortened grass over enormous rings of chalk, and deep ditches full of evening mist, and rooks going home across a sky the colour of a washed plate. There is nothing up there at all. And yet, in the eyes of the law, and on the parchment rolls kept in London, and in the settled opinion of the English Constitution, that empty hill was still a town. Not the memory of a town, not the site of a former town, a town. A borough, in fact, with rights and privileges and a proper corporate existence, and among those rights was the oldest and grandest right an English borough could hold, which was the right to be represented in Parliament. Old Sarum, from about 1295, returned 2 members of Parliament to Westminster. 2 men. And it went on returning them, faithfully and punctually and with complete legality, for more than 500 years, long after the last roof had fallen in, long after the last family had walked down to the meadow, long after there was anybody up there at all to be represented. The hill kept its seats the way an old coat keeps its buttons after the coat itself has gone to pieces. Let that settle over you for a moment, softly, with no need to do anything about it. There is a hill in Wiltshire. It has no houses, no streets, no church, no inn, no forge, no market, no bakers, no children, no chimney smoke, nothing but wind and turf and rabbits, and a very good view. And twice in every Parliament, and sometimes more often than that, the machinery of the English state turned solemnly toward that empty green ring and asked it, with perfect seriousness, whom it would like to send to the House of Commons. And the hill, through the mouths of a small handful of men who did not live there either, answered. This is the part of the story where the old habit of England shows itself most clearly, which is that England very rarely abolishes anything. It simply lets it go on, quietly, out of politeness, long past the point where anyone can remember why it started. The seats had been granted when there was a town to hold them. The town had gone. The seats had not. And so the borough of Old Sarum went on and on, a legal fiction sitting on a real hill, sending real men to make real laws about real people, on the authority of a place that no longer existed. To understand how such a thing could keep working for so long, you have to understand the strange and rather beautiful old idea of the burgage plot. And I promise you this is a soothing thing to know rather than a difficult one, so let it drift past you at whatever speed you like. In the old English boroughs, the right to vote was not attached to a person, it was attached to a piece of ground. A burgage was a plot of land within the borough, held from the lord of the manor for a fixed rent, and whoever held that plot held the vote that went with it. The vote lived in the soil. The vote was a property, like a hedge or a well or a right-of-way, and it could be bought, sold, inherited, mortgaged, given as a wedding present, or left to a nephew in a will, because it was not a voice, it was an asset. Now, in a living town, this arrangement is only a slightly odd way of saying that householders vote. But at Old Sarum, the houses had been gone for a very long time, and the plots had not. The plots stayed exactly where they had always been, under the grass, invisible, marked on nothing but old parchment and older memory, an entire vanished street plan of little rectangles of turf that still, quietly, carried the ancient right of sending men to Parliament. You could stand on a burgage plot at Old Sarum and see absolutely nothing to tell you that you were standing on one. It was a field with sheep on it. And it was, at the same time, a constituency. The number of these ghostly plots was small, and so the number of voters was small. The counts vary a little, as counts of very old and very silly things always do, but the electorate of Old Sarum is usually given as somewhere between 7 and 11 men. 7 to 11, not 7 or 11,000, not 7 or 1100. 7 to 11 men, none of whom lived on the hill, and all of whom held their votes because they held, on paper, a scrap of empty grass. In practice, the whole electorate could usually be persuaded to agree, because in practice the whole electorate was, more or less, the property of whichever wealthy family had bought up the plots. The borough was owned, the way a farm is owned, and passed down and sold on the way a farm is passed down and sold on, and its price was well known. Because a seat in the House of Commons was a thing with a market value. The Pitt family owned it for a long stretch. The hill had no inhabitants, but it had proprietors, and the proprietors were very fond of it indeed, since it was the least troublesome property in England. It never asked for repairs, it never complained about the drains. It had no drains. And now the elections themselves, which are the part I love, and which I will tell you very calmly, because you are meant to be drifting by now, and not sitting up in delight. There was on the hillside an elm tree, a large one, standing on the slope of the old ramparts, in the open air, with the wind going through it as the wind had always gone through everything up there. And because a borough must have somewhere to hold its election, and because the borough of Old Sarum had no town hall, no market cross, no church porch, no building of any kind whatsoever, the elections were held under this tree. It came to be known as the Parliament Tree. Picture it, if picturing is still something you feel like doing, and if it is not, simply let the words go by. A morning in the 17th or 18th century. A few carriages come up the old track from the Salisbury Road and stop on the grass. Out of them step the returning officer, and a clerk with a book, and 7 or 8 or 9 gentlemen in good coats who have travelled some distance to be here, and who will not stay for lunch. There is no crowd, because there is nobody to crowd. There is no hustings, because there is nobody to shout from them. There is a tent sometimes if the weather is unkind, and the weather up there is very often unkind. The writ is read out. The names are proposed and seconded. The gentlemen give their votes, aloud, one after another into the wind. The clerk writes them down. The 2 names are declared elected as members of Parliament for the borough of Old Sarum in the county of Wiltshire, and everybody shakes hands, and gets back into the carriages, and goes away, and the hill returns to the sheep, who have watched the whole constitutional process with the mild interest sheep bring to everything. It took perhaps an hour. It was entirely lawful, and that is how, for centuries, a field elected 2 lawmakers under a tree. There is a dry joke buried in this that I want to set down carefully, because it is the tidiest joke in the whole of English history. Old Sarum had once been the place where William the Conqueror gathered the great landholders of all England to swear allegiance to him, and where the Domesday Book, the greatest survey of people and property ever attempted in this country, came to its conclusion. It had been the hill where England counted itself, and here it was, 600 or 700 years later, the one place in England where the counting had stopped entirely, where a population of nothing at all had twice the representation of a city of tens of thousands. The hill that had once weighed the whole kingdom now weighed nothing, and was still allowed to put its thumb on the scale, because that was the other half of it, and the half that eventually mattered. While the empty hill sent 2 men to Westminster, the new towns of the north sent none. Manchester, roaring, smoking, doubling and doubling again, filling with mills and warehouses and more people than the whole county of Wiltshire had ever held, sent no members of its own at all. Birmingham, hammering out the metal goods of an empire, sent none. Leeds, none. Sheffield, none. Great new places, wide awake, working through the night, and utterly voiceless. And Old Sarum, fast asleep under its own grass for 2 centuries, sending 2. This was not a scandal because anyone had committed a crime. It was a scandal because nobody had. It was simply what happens when a country lets its arrangements outlive their reasons, which is a thing every country does, and which is a thing that is only ever fixed slowly, and usually by argument, and usually about 2 generations later than it should have been. There is a name for boroughs like this, and it is a wonderfully rude name, and it stuck. They were called rotten boroughs, rotten as in a fruit that keeps its shape after the inside has gone. There were dozens of them across England, some with a few voters, some with a handful of houses, some famously reduced to a wall or a mound or a private park. But Old Sarum was the king of them, and the one everybody named, the example in the pamphlets and the example in the speeches and the example in the cartoons. because it was the purest specimen ever produced. Not a small burrow, not a shrinking burrow, not a burrow that had seen better days, but a burrow consisting entirely of grass. If you wanted to explain, in one breath, what was wrong with the unreformed Parliament, you did not need statistics, and you did not need theory. You said the words Old Sarum, and everybody understood, and some of them laughed and some of them did not. And now for the most famous name attached to the empty hill, which is a name you will know even if you have never thought about Wiltshire in your life. In 1735, a young man of 26, lately of the army, lately of Oxford, with a bad temper and a bad case of gout, and a voice that would one day stop the House of Commons dead in its tracks, was returned to Parliament as one of the 2 members for the borough of Old Sarum. His family owned the plots. It cost him nothing but the arrangement. His name was William Pitt, and he is remembered now as William Pitt the Elder, and later as the Earl of Chatham, and he became, by common consent, one of the greatest war ministers this country has ever had. The man who directed the war that won Canada and India and made an empire out of a scattering of trading posts. The man whose name is on a city in Pennsylvania to this day. He sat for Old Sarum until about 1747. And the beginning of all of that, the first constituency of the man who ran the world, was an empty green ring in Wiltshire with about 7 voters and a tree. He never represented anybody there because there was nobody there to represent. He never received a petition from a constituent, never had to explain himself to a single soul who lived on that hill, because not one single soul lived on that hill, and had not for 200 years. I do not tell you this to make him small. It was simply how the thing was done, and he did not invent it, and by every account he served the country rather better than most men who had come in by more respectable doors. But it is a lovely, absurd, very English fact, and I would like to leave it with you as you drift. The greatest war minister of the 18th century began his public life as the member for a field. In 1829, when the arguments about all this were beginning to grow loud, a painter came up onto the hill. John Constable, who had spent his life painting the soft green Suffolk of his childhood, mills and locks and elms and the slow brown water of the Stour, came to Old Sarum and made of it something quite different. A lonely mound under a torn and dramatic sky. A shepherd. A dog. A rainbow, perhaps. The light breaking in long bars over an empty swelling of ground with nothing on it at all. He drew it, and he painted it more than once, and he had it engraved so that it could travel. Here was a place that had been the seat of bishops and kings, and the making of laws, and here it was, grass, a grand ruin, with nothing left to be ruined. It is a picture about the passing of things, painted, as it happens, 3 years before the hill lost the very last function it had. The timing was an accident. Constable was not making a political point about the borough. He was making the older, quieter point that painters have always made about hills, which is that they outlast us, and that they do it without meaning to. But the picture put the empty hill into the national eye at exactly the moment when the nation was about to look at it very hard indeed. And then, in 1832, after years of argument and pamphlets and processions and a great deal of shouting in and out of doors, Parliament reformed itself. The Great Reform Act redrew the map of representation, gave seats to Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds and the other roaring new places, widened the franchise and swept away the rotten boroughs, one after another, in a list. Old Sarum was on that list. Old Sarum was, in a sense, the reason for the list. Its name had been used so often in the debates, as the shorthand for everything wrong and absurd and indefensible, that when the abolition came it was less like a punishment and more like a punchline finally landing. The borough was disenfranchised outright. The 2 seats vanished. The burgage plots went back to being what they had always actually been, which was grass. And the hill, 730 years or so after the Conqueror gathered the landholders of England upon it, and 600 years after its cathedral had walked away downhill, finally, quietly, retired from public life. It had held the king, the mint, the bishop, the Ark of God, the oath of all England, and, at the very end, 2 seats in Parliament and an elm tree. Now it held nothing at all, and it seems in every account to have taken this remarkably well. The elm, by the way, is gone too. It stood a long time, and it was pointed out to visitors, and it was drawn and remembered, and then it did what elms do, which is fall down, and the hill did not replace it. For most of the 19th century, that was the whole of it. Old Sarum was a curiosity on the Salisbury Road, a place where people rode out on a fine afternoon to look at the view and say the words Rotten Borough to one another and feel modern. Sheep grazed the ditches, rabbits kept up their patient private excavations in the banks. And then, in 1909, the archaeologists came, and the hill gave everything back. The Society of Antiquaries began to dig, and they dug for 6 seasons, from 1909 right through to 1915, under the direction first of William St. John Hope, and then of Lieutenant Colonel William Hawley, who would afterwards go and dig, rather more controversially, at Stonehenge, 10 miles off across the plain. What they found under the turf was the whole city, lying exactly where it had been left. The plan of the great cathedral came up out of the grass, nave and aisles and transepts and the eastern end, the foundations still in place, the walls robbed away to the ground, but the shape of them perfectly readable, so that you could suddenly see, for the first time in 6 centuries, precisely how big the vanished church had been, and precisely where the singing had happened. The castle came up, the courtyard, the walls, the gate the garrison had shut. And best of all, in the middle of the castle, Bishop Roger's palace came up, his great courtyard house, the finest domestic building of its age in England, laid out in low lines of flint and mortar under the sky, its rooms still rooms, its thresholds still thresholds. Nobody had built over any of it. Nobody had ploughed it. There had been no reason to. The city had simply been lifted off its own foundations like a cake off a plate, and the foundations had waited, under the grass, for 800 years for somebody to come and look. This is one of the quiet mercies of the whole story, and it is worth resting on. Most vanished towns vanish because something is built on top of them. This one vanished because everything was taken away from it, which means that everything below the ground survived. The move that emptied the hill is the same move that preserved it, and so the diggers with their trowels and their barrows and their beautiful careful drawings were not really discovering a lost place at all. They were reading a plan that had been left out on the table for them, politely, with the lights off. 2 years later, in 1917, with the world at war, an airfield was laid out on the flat fields immediately below the hill. And I offer you this next thought purely because it pleases me, and because you may as well go to sleep smiling. Old Sarum Airfield is one of the oldest continuously used airfields anywhere in the world. It has been in operation, in one way or another, for well over 100 years. And it sits on the very ground where, in about 1070, William the Conqueror gathered his mercenary army for the last time, paid the men off, and sent them home. So the meadow at the foot of the hill has now spent 950 years hearing the sounds of men going away. Horses then, engines now, the same low field, the same chalk under it, the same hill looking down. The hill has always been a place where things assemble and then disperse. It is quite good at it. And that brings us, at last, to today, and to what you would find if you drove up there on any ordinary afternoon, which I hope you do one day, though not tonight, obviously, because tonight you are staying exactly where you are. The site belongs to English heritage now. You can walk up onto the outer ramparts for nothing at all, at any hour. And people do. Dog walkers, runners, families with kites, because the wind that ruined the cathedral is an excellent wind for kites, and it is nice that it finally found a job it is good at. The great outer ring is still there, 56 acres of it, and it is enormous, far larger than photographs suggest, an earthwork so vast and so smooth that your eye keeps refusing it and reading it as landscape. The ditches are deep and dry and green and full of shadow, and in the early morning they hold mist the way a cup holds tea. Sheep graze them, still, as they have for 400 years, wandering along contours that were dug by people who had never heard of Rome. In the middle stands the inner ring and the mound, and there is the castle, low walls now, flint and mortar, waist high. A plan rather than a building, with Bishop Roger's palace laid out beside it, and if you stand in the middle of it on a still day, you can hear rooks and wind and nothing else. And out on the northern side of the outer bailey, where the great church stood, English heritage has done the loveliest thing on the whole site. The outline of the vanished cathedral is marked out in the turf, low stone lines and mown grass, the whole footprint of it, so that you can walk down a nave that is made of nothing but mown lines, and know exactly where the pillars were, exactly where the choir sang, exactly where Osmond's shrine stood before it went down the hill on a cart. You can stand in a cathedral made of grass. Children run through the walls, which is allowed, and which the walls do not mind. The name never left, either. Sarum is everywhere down in the valley, on street signs and school badges, on the names of businesses and roads and hospitals and hills, an old scribe's misreading of an old spelling of an old name, now more permanent than any of the buildings it once described. The Bishop of Salisbury is still, in the old formal usage, the Bishop of Sarum, and Salisbury itself, the busy handsome market city in the meadows, has never legally been called Salisbury at all. Its formal name, granted by Henry III and never rescinded, is New Sarum. 800 years on, the city is still officially describing itself in relation to a hill that has been empty since Henry VIII. That is not a mistake. That is a family keeping its maiden name. The singing did not leave either, though it left in a form you cannot point at. The Sarum use, the order of service and chant that Osmond shaped up there in the wind, spread out from that hilltop across nearly every church in England and Wales and Ireland, and taught the country how to keep a service and how to sing it for 400 years, until the Reformation set it aside. But it did not vanish. It soaked in. It is in the shape of English worship, in the old melodies, in the phrasings that came through into the prayer book and out again into everything since. When an English choir sings even song on a wet Tuesday in a country church, somewhere far back in the grain of what they are doing is a windy hill in Wiltshire, where the singers could not hear themselves over the weather. And 2 miles away, plain as anything from the ramparts on a clear day, across the flat green fields and the water meadows and the quiet grey roofs, there is the spire. 404 feet of it. The tallest church spire in Britain, the tallest then and the tallest still, put up between about 1310 and 1330 by a city that had only just finished moving house, as if to say quite mildly that it had not come down the hill to be smaller. It is a very thin spire. From the hill it looks like a pale needle standing up out of the fields, catching light long after the fields have gone blue, and inside the cathedral beneath it, in a quiet room off the cloister, kept in the dark and shown a little at a time, is one of the 4 surviving original copies of Magna Carta from 1215, and it is the best preserved of the 4, the clearest, the cleanest, the most legible. William Longespie, who laid one of those first 5 foundation stones in the wet grass in 1220 and who lies buried in that same church, had stood as one of the men behind that charter. So the cathedral that the hill walked down to build keeps, in its own house, the best copy of the document that its own founder witnessed. Everything in this story is connected to everything else in this story, gently, without anybody planning it, over 800 years. And now let us pull back, slowly, and look at the whole of it from above, the way you might look down from a very great height at a small green ring in a wide green county, and then let us put it away and go to sleep. Most lost places are taken. That is the ordinary way of it. Cities are burned in war, or emptied by plague, or drowned by rising water or by a reservoir, or shaken down, or cleared away by somebody with power and a plan. Nearly every ruin you have ever stood in is the site of something that happened to somebody. That is why ruins tend to feel the way they feel, which is sad, and a little accusing, and full of an ending. Old Sarum is not that. Nothing happened to Old Sarum. No army came, no fire came, no plague, no flood, no massacre, no tyrant, no catastrophe of any kind whatsoever. There is no villain in this entire long night, and there never was one, and I have been quietly relieved about that from the first minute. What happened to Old Sarum is that the wind was loud, and the water was 200 feet below and had to be bought by the barrel, and the chalk hurt the eyes of men who read for a living, and there was no room, and the soldiers held the gate and sometimes shut it at the wrong moment, and after about 150 years of putting up with this, the people who lived there had a long, polite, extremely well-documented think, and wrote to Rome, and asked, and were told yes, and went. That is all. A whole cathedral city, one of the birthplaces of the English state, packed itself up and walked 2 miles downhill at walking pace, over a generation, house by house and cart by cart, with nobody forced and nobody burned out and nobody left behind, and started again on better ground. And here is what I most want to leave with you as you go under. It took everything with it. It did not lose one single thing it loved. Its stones went with it, and they are standing to this day in the long wall around the cathedral close, so that the old church in pieces is the fence around the new one, still on duty, still keeping the weather off. Its saint went with it, Osmond's shrine went down the hill, and Osmond was made a saint at last in 1457, more than 350 years after he died, which is either a very slow decision or a very careful one. Its bishops went with it, unbroken, one after another, right down to the present day. Its singing went with it, and then went out from there across the whole country. Its name went with it, and is written on the signposts of a living city, and its cathedral went with it, and grew, and put up the tallest spire in Britain, which is standing there in the dusk right now, 2 miles from the empty ring, doing the thing the hill never had room to do. So the hill is not a grave. I want you to have that as you fall asleep, because it is true. The hill is an empty house whose family moved somewhere better and turned at the gate, and looked back once, and left the door standing open behind them, and did not cry because they had not lost anything at all, they had only put it down for a moment while they carried the rest. And the grass came, as grass does, and made the whole thing soft. Places end and go on. Things get set down in one field and picked up again in the next one along. The wind wins some arguments, and it is allowed to. There is no shame in being out-argued by the weather, and there is no failure in leaving a place that has stopped being kind to you. Nothing that is truly remembered is truly lost. It is only 2 miles away, and taller than it ever managed up here. Are you still awake? If you are, that is perfectly all right. You have nothing left to do tonight but breathe, and the hill will still be there in the morning, and so will the spire, and neither of them needs anything from you. If you would like another long, quiet history to carry you the rest of the way down, there is one waiting on the screen for you, and it will begin the moment this one ends, and you will not have to lift a finger. And if you truly enjoyed what I do here, and only if you truly did, you might leave a like, and you might subscribe, and you might tell me in the comments where in the world you are and what your local time is, so that all the other sleepless people can see how many of us are lying awake together in the dark. But none of that matters now. Let the hill go quiet. Let the sheep have the nave. Let the mist come up out of the ditches the way it always does, and let the last light leave the spire 2 miles off across the fields, the way it has every evening for 700 years. Let your shoulders come down. Let your breath go long and slow and easy. There is nothing left to worry about. It was all settled 800 years ago by people who were kind to one another. On a hill in Wiltshire, in the wind. Close your eyes now. Good night and sweet dreams.